There is something quietly staggering about the summer of 1941 that took me years of reading to fully absorb. Not in the numbers alone, but in what the numbers mean about human endurance under conditions that should have produced only collapse. On the 22nd of June, 3.8 million German and Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory along a front stretching roughly 1,800 miles, supported by somewhere between 3,300 and 3,700 tanks. On the Soviet side, the Red Army held on paper a force of nearly 5 million men and somewhere around 7,000 tanks along that same border. And yet, within the first 8 days, the Luftwaffe had destroyed an estimated 2,000 Soviet aircraft, most of them while still on the ground, their wings catching morning light one moment and then burning the next. Entire Soviet armies did not just retreat, they fractured, their command network severed at the top because Stalin's purges between 1937 and 1940 had already eroded 13 out of 15 army-level commanders, 50 out of 57 corps commanders, and 154 out of 186 division commanders. The men left to hold the line had never commanded at the scale the war immediately demanded of them. The encirclements came fast enough to feel almost mechanical in their rhythm. At Minsk, roughly 300,000 Soviet soldiers were swallowed by the German advance in the first weeks. At Smolensk, another 310,000. At Kiev in September, 665,000 men, an entire strategic army group, were cut off, surrounded, and absorbed into German prisoner columns that stretched for miles across the Ukrainian steppe, men walking in the August heat without water, covering ground at a pace measured in kilometers per day toward camps where the mortality rate would eventually reach roughly 60%. The Red Army, by any reasonable military calculus, had been broken, and yet it had not been finished. What kept it alive in those first months was partly desperation, partly geography, and partly a decision made at the highest levels of Soviet industrial planning that would not show its full weight for another 18 months. Factories, entire tank plants, artillery foundries, machine tool shops were physically dismantled in the autumn of 1941 and loaded onto trains heading east of the Ural Mountains, away from the German advance. Over 1,500 industrial enterprises were relocated, some of them reassembled in Siberian cities, and producing their first war material within 90 days of arrival. By 1942, Soviet factories were building approximately 24,000 tanks annually. By 1943, that figure held steady even as German production struggled toward 10,800. By 1944, Soviet tank output had climbed to 17,800 in a single year. A T-34, weighing roughly 26 tons, with a 500 horsepower diesel engine, cost the Soviet state approximately 135,000 rubles to produce by mid-war, and the factories were stamping them out in shifts that ran through every hour of every day, the floor vibrating under workers' feet the way a tank hull vibrates when its engine turns at full throttle. The gap between what Germany could field and what the Red Army could replace did not close. It widened, year by year, in one direction only. Stalingrad, through the autumn and winter of 1942 and into February of 1943, was the hinge. The city itself was roughly 35 miles long along the Volga's western bank, and the fighting for it compressed roughly 290,000 German and Axis troops into a shrinking perimeter after Operation Uranus closed the pocket in November. Soviet forces used roughly 3,500 guns and mortars for the opening artillery barrage on the 19th of November, a barrage that shook the ground for dozens of miles around and lasted approximately 80 minutes before the armor moved. When the 6th Army surrendered on the 2nd of February 1943, 91,000 men walked into Soviet captivity. Of those, roughly 5,000 eventually returned to Germany after the war. The Red Army had paid an enormous price for this. Soviet losses at Stalingrad reached into the hundreds of thousands. But the arithmetic of attrition had shifted. Germany was now losing men and machines faster than it could replace them. The Red Army was not. By the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration deployed 1,200,000 Soviet troops, 5,200 tanks, and over 5,000 aircraft against Army Group Center's 41 divisions, and destroyed 28 of those divisions in roughly 8 weeks. A pace of operational destruction that has few parallels in modern warfare. The Red Army that crossed into Germany in early 1945 bore almost no structural resemblance to the force that had fractured in June 1941. It fielded 12 million men, had absorbed 4 years of industrial output that outpaced anything Germany produced, and moved with a coordination, artillery, armor, infantry, air support, that its commanders had bled to learn through the grinding disasters of the war's first 2 years. Berlin fell in late April and early May of 1945, at a cost of roughly 81,000 Soviet dead in 2 weeks of street fighting, a number that still stuns anyone who pauses long enough to hold it in their mind. So let the shape of that arc settle over you now, quietly. The way the history of something immense tends to settle when the hour is late and there is nowhere else to be. A force that fractured in the summer heat of 1941, that bled through 4 winters, that recalibrated its factories, its doctrine, its commanders, and its machines until it was, by 1945, an instrument of industrial war with no equivalent on Earth. The full journey, from the burning airfields of the first June morning to the flag above the Reichstag, is what this documentary carries, hour by hour, battle by battle. This is the entire history of the Red Army, 1941 to 1945, from collapse to conqueror. In the Russian state military archive that most people have never heard of, a document contains signals log, not a battle report, not a commander's memoirs, not a piece of propaganda, just a routine administrative record from the Western Special Military District, typed on a standard Soviet military form, time-stamped at 4 minutes past 4 in the morning on the 22nd of June, 1941. The entry reads, in translation, "Communications with border units lost. Awaiting clarification." That's it. That is the Soviet Union's first official written record of the greatest military catastrophe in the history of modern warfare. Not a dramatic dispatch, not a cry for help, a bureaucratic note about waiting. The horror is in the patience of the language. Before we talk about what happened on that morning, we need to talk about what was already broken before the first German shell landed. Because the story of the Red Army's collapse in the summer of 1941 is not simply a story about German military skill, though that skill was formidable. It is a story about an institution that had been systematically damaged from within, damaged by paranoia, by political interference, by the murder of its own best minds, and that the German invasion of June 22nd was the hammer blow that revealed cracks already running through the foundation. The Red Army didn't shatter because Germany was invincible. It shattered because it was already fractured. To understand how fractured, you have to go back to 1937. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin's security services arrested approximately 35,000 Red Army officers. Among those arrested and executed were 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, 13 of the 16 army commanders, and 50 of the 57 corps commanders. The man at the center of that first wave of executions was Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most innovative military thinkers in Europe, a man who had spent the early 1930s developing a doctrine of simultaneous, multi-axis deep offensive operations that would, ironically, look very similar to the tactics that eventually won the war. He was arrested in June of 1937. He was dead within 2 weeks. The doctrine died with him. or was suppressed anyway. The ideas were still there. They just had no one left to teach them. What the Purge left behind, by June of 1941, was an officer corps that had been so thoroughly hollowed out that the men commanding Soviet divisions on the border had been holding their current rank for an average of less than 11 months. Think about what that means in practical terms. A division commander, responsible for roughly 10,000 men, coordinating artillery, logistics, signals, and infantry in three-dimensional space against a prepared enemy, had been doing that specific job for less than a year. Many had been promoted, not because of demonstrated operational competence, but because the men above them were dead or in prison camps. And alongside each of these commanders, at every level above company, sat a political commissar with dual signing authority over operational orders. This commissar was not a military professional. He was a political officer, trained in ideology, responsible for ensuring ideological loyalty, and holding the legal power to countermand a professional military decision. The combination was catastrophic. Professional officers would not act without political approval. Political officers lacked the tactical knowledge to give it. And so, at precisely the moment when speed was everything, the Soviet command system was architecturally incapable of speed. On the 22nd of June, 1941, 3 German army groups, North, Center, and South, crossed the Soviet border simultaneously, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, along a front roughly 1,800 kilometers long. It was, in terms of raw numbers, the largest land invasion in history. Army Group Center, driving toward Moscow, committed approximately 1 million men and more than 1,700 tanks in its initial thrust. The Wehrmacht's operational concept, blitzkrieg at the strategic level, relied on speed and encirclement, armored spearheads driving deep behind Soviet positions, cutting off communications and supply, and leaving entire Soviet armies stranded, confused, and unreachable by any command authority. And it worked. It worked with a horrifying efficiency that shocked even experienced German commanders. Within 6 days, the Wehrmacht had completed the Bialystok-Minsk encirclement, trapping an estimated 341,000 Soviet soldiers. Within 9 weeks, the total number of Red Army prisoners exceeded 2 million. There is something specific I want you to understand about the communications failure of those first hours, because it goes deeper than organizational chaos. The Red Army's standard tactical radio at the battalion and regimental level, the RSBF, operated on fixed frequencies. Fixed. And from November of 1940 onward, German signals intelligence units, the Funkhorsch Company, had been systematically mapping those frequencies using intercepts gathered during the Finnish Winter War of 1939 to 1940. When Soviet units tried to transmit on the morning of June 22nd, German jamming equipment was already tuned to those exact frequencies. Simultaneously, German armored columns, advancing at 40 to 50 kilometers per day, were physically overrunning the field telephone wire networks that Soviet units depended on below the radio level. The Red Army was severed from itself, not just organizationally, not just because commanders panicked, but because the electromagnetic architecture of its communications had been identified, mapped, and was being suppressed in real time by an enemy who had done his homework. The Kessel didn't destroy the Red Army with fire alone. It destroyed it with silence. The fate of the Western Special Military District, the Soviet front most directly in Army Group Center's path, was sealed within 72 hours. Its commander, General Dmitry Pavlov, lost contact with his forward armies almost immediately. His headquarters received fragments of information, a report from one corps, nothing from another, garbled transmissions suggesting breakthroughs here and there, and could do almost nothing coherent with any of it. By June 28th, the district had effectively ceased to function as a military organization. 6 days later, Pavlov was arrested. On the 22nd of July, exactly 1 month after the invasion began, he was executed. Stalin's government issued a directive blaming Pavlov personally. His cowardice, his criminal negligence, his individual failure, for what had been a systemic catastrophe years in the making. That document, Directive number 481, is preserved in the archive. It is a study in how an institution protects itself by destroying an individual. Pavlov didn't cause the collapse of the Western Front. He was simply the man standing in the wreckage when Stalin needed someone to blame. Now, I've spent considerable time with the intelligence record of 1941, and there is an aspect of this story that still genuinely unsettles me. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's so precisely documented and so completely ignored at the moment it mattered. Between January and June of 1941, Stalin received at least 84 separate intelligence warnings about an imminent German attack. 84. They came from British intelligence, from the Soviet spy network in Tokyo run by Richard Sorge, from GRU military intelligence, and from German Communist Party members embedded within the Wehrmacht itself. Men whose information was specific enough to include assembly areas for individual units. Stalin dismissed every single one. His reasoning was not ignorance. He was not a stupid man. His reasoning was that he was being manipulated, that Britain, in particular, was feeding him false intelligence to drag the Soviet Union into a premature war with Germany. He was wrong. And that specific miscalculation, the decision of one man who trusted his own political analysis over 84 pieces of converging evidence, cost the Red Army its first 3 months. What I find most remarkable, and I use that word carefully because I'm genuinely still working through the historiographical implications, is that the Red Army didn't collapse entirely. In any rational military analysis of mid-July 1941, the Soviet Union should have been finished. It had lost more soldiers as prisoners in 2 months than France's entire army had possessed in 1940. It had lost thousands of aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground in the first 48 hours. Its command structure above the divisional level had essentially stopped functioning. And yet, it didn't collapse. Individual Soviet units, cut off, surrounded, out of ammunition, continued to fight. Garrison forces held fortifications for days and weeks after they had been formally encircled and written off. The Brest fortress, right on the border, right at the point of the first German assault, held out for weeks in conditions that military logic said were impossible. Something was there, some structural flaw beneath the catastrophe. The question of what it was, what held the institution together when everything institutional had failed, is the question that drives the next 4 years of this story. By the end of 1941, the Red Army had suffered losses that no other nation-state in modern history has survived as a functioning entity. The German army had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow, to the gates of Leningrad, deep into Ukraine. The Soviet Union had lost access to vast swathes of its most productive agricultural land and industrial territory. And yet, the war had not ended. The Wehrmacht, which had planned a campaign of 12 weeks based on the assumption of Soviet institutional collapse, was still fighting in December. Something had gone wrong with Germany's calculation, and something had gone right with Russia's survival. Understanding both of those things requires understanding not just the battles, but the specific material and organizational choices made in the chaos between June and December of 1941. It requires understanding what happened when a state, faced with extinction, made the most audacious logistical gamble in the history of modern warfare. 1,523 factories. I want to be clear about something before we begin this chapter. What follows is almost entirely a story about railway gauges, production schedules, and crane capacities. There are no famous battles here. there are no heroic last stands. If this section feels different, drier, more technical, more uncomfortable, that is intentional. The story of how the Soviet Union saved itself in the autumn of 1941 was not told in the language of courage. It was told in the language of logistics, and it is a story that most histories of the Second World War treat as a footnote when it should be the headline. Between July and November of 1941, the Soviet government moved approximately 1,523 large industrial enterprises, factories, foundries, assembly plants, machine shops, from the western regions of the country eastward, beyond the Ural Mountains and into Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia. Along with those factories went an estimated 16.5 million Soviet civilians. They moved by train. They moved under constant German air attack. They moved without adequate shelter, waiting for them at their destinations. And many of them moved knowing that the factory they were dismantling and loading onto flat cars was the only reason they weren't being conscripted directly into a rifle unit and sent to the front. The scale of this operation has no precedent in military-industrial history. Moving an equivalent proportion of Germany's industrial base, or Britain's, or America's, under those conditions, in that time frame, would have been considered physically impossible. The Soviet Union did it because the alternative was not having a country. The mechanics of the operation were coordinated by the Soviet People's Commissariat of Railways, known by its Russian initials NKPS, under directives issued by the State Defense Committee, the GKO, beginning in the first week of July 1941. The rail network east of the Urals had a theoretical single-track capacity of approximately 850 trains per day. At the peak of the evacuation, in October and November of 1941, the system was running more than 1,400 trains per day, roughly 65% above its designed maximum. This was achieved by eliminating all civilian passenger services, reducing scheduled maintenance windows by approximately 70%, and driving locomotive engineers for shifts documented at over 72 hours without relief. At least 180 locomotives were destroyed through neglected maintenance during this period. That figure comes from NKPS operational reports. The GKO considered it an acceptable loss, which tells you everything you need to know about the calculus of survival. There is a dispatch log entry from the Volga crossing at Saratov, dated the 14th of October, 1941, that I keep returning to because it captures the human texture of this operation in a way that statistics cannot. A numbered rail convoy of 47 flat cars, carrying the press tooling of the Kharkov Locomotive Works, had been rerouted twice in 36 hours as the front line shifted. It arrived at Chelyabinsk with 11 cars missing. The reason given for the loss? Unclear. The tooling that arrived would eventually become part of the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, which would eventually produce T-34 tanks. The 11 missing cars were never accounted for. Nobody wrote a report explaining what happened to them. There wasn't time. The remaining 36 cars contained something more valuable than any single piece of machinery. They contained the institutional knowledge of the workers who traveled with them, the men and women who knew how to operate the equipment and could, if given the barest minimum of shelter and power, get it running again. The destination for most of the evacuated capacity was Chelyabinsk, in the southern Urals, a city that would acquire the unofficial designation Tankograd, or Tank City, and earn it honestly. The Kharkov Comintern Locomotive Factory, the Leningrad Kirov plant, and the Chelyabinsk tractor plant were, in effect, merged into a single continuous production operation, sharing floor space, tooling, and workers. By February of 1942, this merged complex was producing T-34 tanks on a production line that was still, in significant sections, operating under open sky. The roof had not been finished yet. Workers assembled tank hull sections in temperatures that dropped below -30 degrees Celsius without adequate protective equipment, because the supply allocation for insulated work gloves had not been formally processed. This detail comes from a memoir fragment published in a 1975 Soviet veterans collection, written by a woman named Klavdia Averianova, who was present. The cold is the detail she remembers most specifically, decades later. Not ideology, not duty. The cold on her hands on bare metal. Now, here is where I need to be precise about a historical debate that matters, because it changes how we understand the entire subsequent war. The popular narrative about the Soviet war economy frequently invokes American Lend-Lease aid as the decisive factor. The argument being that without American tanks, trucks, and food, the Soviet Union would have lost. The data does not support this in its simple form, and the more careful version of the argument is both more accurate and more interesting. On the 1st of January 1943, 18 months into the war, 6 months into the critical Stalingrad campaign, Lend-Lease trucks constituted approximately 6 3/10% of the trucks in the Red Army. 6.3%. At that point, the battle that would determine the war's outcome was already being decided by forces that were overwhelming in their proportion domestically produced. What Lend-Lease actually provided was complementary capacity in specific categories where Soviet production was structurally inadequate. 4.5 million tons of food rations, enormous quantities of aluminum and high-octane aviation fuel, telephone wire, railway locomotives, explosives. These were not glamorous contributions, they were load-bearing ones. The factories in the Urals produced the tanks and guns. The Studebaker trucks and the canned meat kept the men operating them alive and mobile. Both were necessary, neither alone was sufficient. The T-34's transformation between 1941 and 1943 is one of the most instructive industrial stories of the war, and it is almost never told honestly. The original 1940 model required approximately 3,000 man-hours to produce. By 1943, the simplified T-34, with its new welded hexagonal turret, replacing the complex rounded cast turret of the earlier model, required approximately 1,200 to 1,400 man-hours. That is a reduction of more than 50% in production time. How was this achieved? Not through technological innovation, through deliberate, selective degradation. The finished interior surfaces were eliminated. Weld seam quality standards were reduced to the minimum structurally necessary. The internal crew telephone system was removed. The transmission was simplified to a 4-speed gearbox that broke more frequently than its predecessor, but could be replaced in the field in under 4 hours by a crew without specialized tools. The tank was made worse as an engineering object, so that it could be made in greater numbers as a strategic object. In 1942, Soviet factories produced 12,553 T-34s. In the same year, Germany produced approximately 4,278 Panzer IVs. The arithmetic of that gap is the story of the war. There is a question that historians have debated since the Soviet archives partially opened in the 1990s, and it concerns the actual success rate of the evacuation. Soviet GKO post-war assessments claimed that approximately 85% of evacuated industrial capacity had been successfully restored to production by mid-1942. A 1946 internal Gosplan review, the State Planning Committee's own honest accounting, placed the figure for full capacity restoration at somewhere between 58 and 62%. The gap between those two numbers is not trivial. It means that between a quarter and a third of what was moved either never restarted or restarted at such reduced capacity as to be functionally marginal. The 85% figure was the politically useful number, the number that demonstrated the system's success. The 58 to 62% figure was the economically honest number, the one that explained why certain categories of production remained constrained well into 1943. Both figures are from Soviet state sources. They cannot both be correct. The document that contained the lower figure was classified until 1992. The city of Magnitogorsk deserves a specific mention, because what happened there is one of the most extraordinary industrial stories of the 20th century, and almost no one outside specialist military history knows it. Magnitogorsk was a raw steel city in the southern Urals, barely 20 years old in 1941. Its population of 145,000, composed largely of political deportees, former prison laborers, and peasants relocated from the forced collectivization of the early 1930s. In 1943, Magnitogorsk produced more steel than the entire output of all the French foundries captured by Germany. More steel. A city of fewer than 150,000 people, many of whom had arrived in chains, outproducing the captured industrial capacity of France. The factory that forged the material basis of the Red Army's recovery was built on the labor of people the Soviet state had treated as expendable. That contradiction between the human cost of building the capacity and the strategic value of having it sits at the very center of the Soviet war effort, and there is no clean resolution to it. By the end of 1941, 16.5 million people had been relocated. 1,523 large factories had been dismantled and reassembled in conditions that peacetime industrial planners would have considered impossible. And the production lines were beginning to turn again. The Red Army was still losing. The Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow. But the means of eventual recovery, the physical, industrial means, had been placed beyond German reach. The question that remained, the question that would determine whether any of this industrial heroism translated into military survival, was whether there were still enough men left to operate the weapons, and enough officers left to lead the men. The answer, as we'll see, was technically yes. But the form that answer took was one of the most brutal and honest admissions in the history of military institutions. The men who replaced the dead. There is an enrollment record from the Ryazan Infantry School, dated October of 1941, that is about as plain and devastating as any document I've encountered in this archive. 847 cadets enrolled. Standard pre-war course length, 24 months. Course length assigned to this specific cohort, 12 weeks. There is no footnote in the document explaining the reduction. No memo attached justifying the decision. The reduction simply appears as a bureaucratic fact. 12 weeks, stamped and filed. Because everyone in the building already understood why, and no one needed it explained. The Red Army needed lieutenants. It needed them in 3 months. It had no other choice. The People's Commissariat of Defense, the NKO, formalized this reality in October of 1941 through Order Number 890, which reduced all infantry officer training across the Soviet system to a maximum of 3 to 4 months. This was not a decision anyone wanted to make. The Soviet military education system had, before the war, produced officers through a rigorous, multi-year curriculum that covered not just infantry tactics, but combined arms coordination, logistics, artillery liaison, and operational planning. The men trained in that system, the survivors of it, the ones who hadn't been shot in the Purges, were now commanding fronts and armies. The men who would replace them at the bottom of the pyramid, the lieutenants commanding platoons in the winter fighting of 1941 to 1942, had 12 weeks. In those 12 weeks, a cadet learned rifle platoon tactics, basic map reading, Soviet military regulations, and how to file a casualty report. What he did not learn, what the curriculum, preserved in the Russian Military History Archive, does not contain, was how to coordinate with artillery, how to communicate with tank units, how to plan a logistics resupply under fire. These were not deliberate omissions. There simply wasn't time. The consequence of this is captured in a complaint letter that I find among the most direct and uncomfortable primary sources from the entire war. In 1943, General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army during the Stalingrad campaign, filed a report with his superiors specifically addressing the quality of newly arrived junior officers. The language is not diplomatic. Zhukov wrote that newly commissioned lieutenants could not read a topographical map at a scale above 1 to 25,000, and that they were unfamiliar with the standard artillery request procedure. This is a combat army commander telling his superiors that the men being sent to command his platoons do not know how to call in artillery support. In the middle of a battle. The Soviet Official History of Military Education, published in 1967, describes the accelerated training program of this period as having maintained quality standards through intensive instruction. Chuikov's letter and that official history describe two entirely different realities. What happened to these men once they reached the front is documented in an NKO internal study on officer casualty rates, conducted in 1943 and declassified in the 1990s. The median combat survival time for a newly commissioned Soviet infantry platoon lieutenant in 1942, the median, meaning the middle of the distribution, not the worst case, was approximately 3 weeks after reaching the front. Company commanders lasted approximately 5 to 6 weeks. Battalion commanders, with more distance from the forward line, averaged roughly 3 months. These figures represent a mortality rate so high that the concept of individual military experience, of learning from mistakes, was functionally impossible for anyone holding one of those ranks. The system was producing men and consuming them at rates that prevented institutional learning at the junior level. What it was actually doing, though no one planned it this way, was conducting a lethal selection process. The lieutenants who survived 3 weeks became lieutenants who had learned something. The ones who survived 6 weeks had learned more. By 1943, the junior officer corps of the Red Army, the men who had lived through 1942, were, on average, substantially more capable than anyone who had trained them had a right to expect, precisely because they'd had to learn in the worst possible school. In 1942 alone, the Soviet NKO commissioned approximately 281,000 new junior officers through accelerated programs. 281,000. To put that in context, that figure exceeds the total officer strength of the entire Red Army in 1937, after the Purges had done their work. The Soviet state was commissioning, in a single year, more officers than it had possessed in its officer corps 4 years earlier. And it was doing so through 12-week programs run in buildings that were sometimes simultaneously receiving air raid alerts. The mathematics of this are not inspiring. They are the mathematics of desperation dressed in the language of organization. There is something quietly extraordinary about the men who came back from the initial purges. Not the ones who were rehabilitated politically, but the ones who were rehabilitated because the Finnish War of 1939 to 1940 had demonstrated so catastrophically how badly the officer corps had been gutted. Approximately 11,000 of the roughly 35,000 officers arrested between 1937 and 1938 were released before June of 1941 and reinstated to command positions. Among them was Konstantin Rokossovsky, arrested in 1937, tortured by NKVD interrogators. He lost several teeth to the process, he describes it in his memoirs without drama, and released in 1940. He would go on to command the most successful operation of the entire war. But what interests me about Rokossovsky specifically is not his strategic brilliance. It's the psychological texture of his command style, documented in multiple subordinates' accounts of a man who had survived state terror and emerged from it with a very specific quality, an ability to tell Stalin to his face in a Stavka meeting in 1943 that he believed a proposed order was wrong, and to say so 3 times and to be listened to. That quality, professional courage in a system that killed people for it, was not common. And it was not accidental. It had been tempered by something that peacetime military education could never replicate. The 12-week lieutenant is the demographic truth of the Red Army in 1942. The army that won the war between 1943 and 1945 was not the army that had been trained. It was the army that had survived what training couldn't prepare anyone for and had drawn its own conclusions. That distinction matters enormously when we try to understand how the transformation happened, because it wasn't top-down, and it wasn't the product of any single reform or doctrine. It was the product of individuals at the lowest levels of command being forced, under conditions of extreme pressure, to solve problems that the institution above them had no answers for. The solutions they found, the tactical innovations they invented in basements and rubble fields, would eventually filter upward and become the formal doctrine of the army that reached Berlin. But that is getting ahead of the story. What the winter of 1941 to 1942 left the Red Army with was a cohort of very young men, most of them in their late teens and early 20s, holding ranks they'd been given after 12 weeks of instruction, commanding platoons and companies in conditions of extreme cold and continuous combat, against an enemy that was at the absolute peak of its technical and tactical capability. The survival rate among this cohort was terrible, but the survivors, the specific, particular individuals who made it through the winter and into the spring of 1942, were beginning to become something that the Wehrmacht had not planned for. They were becoming experienced. And in a war that was ultimately decided by who could learn faster under fire, experience was the most valuable resource on the Eastern Front. The Diary of the Encircled. There is a piece of paper in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, Germany, that began its existence as a Soviet soldier's diary and ended up in a German archive because the man who was writing it was captured somewhere in the Kiev Encirclement in the autumn of 1941. It passed through German military intelligence, was catalogued, filed, and eventually survived the war on the wrong side of the front. The entry I keep returning to is dated the 18th of September, 1941, 4 days before the Kiev Encirclement was formally completed, when the man writing it apparently still didn't fully understand what was happening around him. He wrote, "No one has told us anything since Tuesday. We ate the last of the bread yesterday. Komarov says we should walk east. We don't know which way east is." The Kiev Encirclement of September 1941 was, by any military measure, the largest single encirclement in the history of warfare. 4 complete Soviet armies, the 5th, the 37th, the 26th, and the 21st, were cut off and destroyed. The German Army Group South's war diary puts the prisoner count at approximately 665,000 men. Those numbers have been contested by subsequent historians, but even the most conservative revisions place the figure in the hundreds of thousands. The Soviet Southwestern Front, which had been responsible for defending Ukraine, effectively ceased to exist as a military organization in the space of a week. Its commander, General Mikhail Kirponos, had spent much of August and early September sending Stavka urgent requests for authorization to withdraw to a more defensible line, requests that Stalin personally denied. Kirponos died on the 20th of September. Attempting to break out of the encirclement, he had warned his superiors they needed to avoid. His last radio transmission to Stavka requested permission to attempt a breakout with the forces remaining to him. Permission was granted approximately 9 hours after his death. The question of what happened inside the encirclements, what the experience of being surrounded and cut off actually felt like to the individual soldiers living through it, is one that Soviet official history handled by largely avoiding it. The narrative preferred by the state was one of heroic resistance to the last, of men fighting until they had nothing left to fight with. The diary evidence and the German prisoner of war camp intake records showing the scale of the surrenders make this narrative statistically impossible to sustain for the full 665,000. The men who ended up in German captivity were, almost by definition, men who had made a decision or found themselves unable to make any other decision about survival. The Soviet state had a specific legal framework for this situation. Stalin's Order No. 270, issued on the 16th of August 1941, declared that soldiers who allowed themselves to be captured were traitors to the motherland, and specified that their families could be subject to reprisal. The diary evidence shows that soldiers were aware of this order before the encirclements, aware of it, and surrounded anyway. What the diaries from the encircled period reveal, and there are enough of them in German, Soviet, and post-Soviet archives to constitute a genuine corpus of evidence, is a pattern that cuts against both the heroic narrative and the cowardice narrative. The men writing these entries are not heroic in the literary sense. They are not defiant. They are, increasingly, simply exhausted and confused. There is a striking linguistic pattern in the collected diary evidence, which several post-Soviet historians have noted. The ideological vocabulary, phrases referencing fascist enemies, sacred duty, communist solidarity, tends to diminish sharply after approximately the third day of encirclement. Before encirclement, diary language reflects the official register of Soviet political culture. After 3 days without food, without orders, without any coherent picture of what was happening, the language becomes personal, immediate, and specific. Food. Cold. The names of the men nearby. The distance to a stream. The ideological framework that the Soviet state had spent 20 years constructing as the container for individual experience was, under conditions of extreme pressure, replaced by something more basic and more honest. The fate of those who surrendered was, in most cases, terrible. The German High Command had made a specific decision, documented in OKW directives from the summer of 1941, to classify Soviet prisoners of war outside the protection of the Geneva Convention. The USSR had not signed the convention in the relevant form, which provided Germany with a legal fig leaf for what was, in practice, a policy of calculated starvation and neglect. By December of 1941, between 2 and 2.5 million Soviet prisoners had already died in German captivity. The primary cause was not direct violence, though violence occurred. The primary cause was deliberate starvation, exposure, and the denial of medical care. A Soviet soldier who survived the encirclement and chose surrender in September of 1941 was, in most cases, choosing a death that would come more slowly than the one he was trying to avoid. He almost certainly didn't know this. The scale of the mortality in the camps was not public knowledge on either side. The men who escaped encirclement, who fought their way out or evaded capture through forest and marsh, faced a different kind of ordeal on the Soviet side. The NKVD operated a system of filtration camps through which escaped or liberated soldiers were processed to determine whether they had voluntarily surrendered and subsequently collaborated. This process, which involved interrogation, investigation, and detention, could take weeks or months. Multiple documented cases exist in the filtration camp records accessible through post-Soviet archival releases of men who had fought their way out of encirclements over days or weeks, spending longer in Soviet filtration camps than they had spent in the encirclement itself. The state's assumption, built into the architecture of the process, was that survival itself required justification. Reading through the diary material from the encircled period, I find myself sitting with a specific kind of discomfort that I want to name honestly. The entries that stay with me are not the ones that describe dramatic moments. They are the ones that describe boredom. Multiple accounts from soldiers in the Kiev pocket and the Vyazma-Bryansk pocket, the second Great Encirclement of October 1941, which trapped an additional approximately 600,000 men near Moscow, describe days of simply waiting, sitting in woods, eating nothing, hearing artillery in directions that no longer corresponded to any map they possessed. Institutional collapse, experienced from inside it, does not feel like a battle. It feels like abandonment. And that specific feeling of being left, of the organization above you having ceased to function while you continued to exist inside it, is the emotional reality that the official history spent 40 years trying to overwrite. The Vyazma-Bryansk encirclement of October 1941, coming just as the Wehrmacht launched Operation Typhoon against Moscow, captured or destroyed an estimated additional 600,000 Soviet soldiers. Within the space of roughly 4 months, the Red Army had lost through encirclement alone more than 1 million men as prisoners, with additional hundreds of thousands killed or wounded in the same operations. The combined losses from the summer and autumn of 1941 exceeded the total military strength of most European nations. And yet, the front line still existed. There was still a Soviet army, fragmented, exhausted, badly under-equipped, and led by survivors rather than professionals, but present. The Germans would reach the suburbs of Moscow in December of 1941, before the front stabilized. What stopped them there was partly the onset of winter and partly Soviet reserves from Siberia, released when intelligence from Richard Sorge in Tokyo confirmed that Japan was not about to attack the Soviet Far East. But it was also something that military analysis has a harder time quantifying: the simple refusal of a sufficient number of people in a sufficient number of places to stop fighting, even when every rational argument said they should. Order 227. On the 28th of July, 1942, Stalin signed a military order that the Soviet government classified as secret and did not publicly release for 46 years. It was not published in the Soviet Union until August of 1988, under Gorbachev's glasnost policy. In that span of time, 46 years, every soldier who served in the Red Army during the war was aware that the order existed because it had been read aloud to all frontline units in the summer of 1942. But its exact text was classified. The soldiers knew the content. The content was kept from the historians. When it was finally printed in the Military History Journal, Wojenno-Historicheski Journal, in 1988, several Soviet historians noted in print that the document was more honest about Soviet military failure than anything contained in the official multi-volume history of the Great Patriotic War. That is not a small observation. It means the secret document was, for half a century, more truthful than the public history. The order's opening lines are worth reading in full because they are unlike any other document the Soviet state produced during the war. Stalin wrote, "The enemy throws new forces at the front without sparing them and penetrates deep into the Soviet Union. Our country is experiencing gravest danger." That word, danger, appeared in an official military order signed by the leader of the Soviet Union. A man who had executed generals for using similar language in 1941 was now writing it himself, under his own signature, in a classified document distributed to every frontline formation. The context for this shift was the German summer offensive of 1942, Case Blue, or Operation Blau, which had driven Army Group South deep into the Caucasus and along the Don River toward a city on the Volga called Stalingrad. Rostov-on-Don fell to the Germans on the 23rd of July, 1942. The Don front was in visible disarray. Soviet operational records from July of that year document multiple instances of Red Army units withdrawing without orders. In some cases, entire regiments moving rearward without authorization. The order was not ideology. It was a response to documented reality. The operational provisions of Order Number 227 were specific and, in their specificity, brutal. Each army was to form between 3 and 5 blocking detachments, each of 200 men. These detachments were to be positioned immediately behind frontline units, with instructions to prevent unauthorized withdrawal, with force if necessary. The blocking detachment soldiers were drawn from NKVD-trained units rather than army units, a deliberate choice. The intent was to use men without unit loyalty to the soldiers they were assigned to monitor. Each front was also required to establish penal battalions, Strafbati, for officers convicted of cowardice or unauthorized retreat, units that would be assigned the most dangerous combat assignments as a form of what the Order's language called blood redemption. A convicted officer could, in theory, restore his rank through a demonstrated act of exceptional courage. The system brutally incentivized extraordinary risk-taking among men who had, in the most literal sense, nothing further to lose. The question of how many Soviet soldiers were killed by their own side through this mechanism is one of the most contested figures in the entire historiography of the Eastern Front. A 1991 internal Russian Ministry of Defense review published in Voyenno-Historicheski Journal suggested that blocking detachments and associated security forces killed approximately 150,000 Soviet soldiers over the course of the war, with some estimates placing 15,000 of those deaths during the Battle of Stalingrad alone. A subsequent revisionist analysis by Russian military historian Alexei Isayev argued that the 150,000 figure was substantially inflated, and that documented executions by blocking detachments numbered in the tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. Neither figure is small. The gap between the two, between tens of thousands and 150,000, is not a disagreement about interpretation. It is a disagreement about what the archive contains, and specifically about what has been made accessible versus what remains classified. The silence in the archive is itself a form of evidence. It just doesn't tell you what it's hiding. The penal battalion system touched approximately 422,000 men over the course of the war, according to NKO records published by historian Gennady Krivosheev in 1993. The first serious post-Soviet attempt at a comprehensive accounting using actual military documents. 422,000 men passed through Strafbat units. Their assignments were, by institutional design, the assignments most likely to result in death. Clearing minefields in advance of assaulting infantry, attacking prepared positions across open ground, holding bridgehead positions against counterattack without artillery support. The mortality rate in penal units was substantially higher than in standard rifle formations, though precise comparative figures are difficult to establish because unit records were kept inconsistently. The system was, from the perspective of the men who passed through it, an organized method of converting military failure into military expenditure. And from the perspective of certain unit commanders, it was occasionally useful. A penal formation assigned to a particularly dangerous task was a formation that would fight with a specific and ferocious concentration, because the men in it understood that their only path back to the ordinary risks of ordinary service was through the extraordinary risk in front of them. There is something I want to address directly about Order 227, because it tends to be discussed in two ways that I both find inadequate. The first is the triumphalist Soviet framing, which treated the order as evidence of heroic determination and iron discipline, the state proving its resolve at the moment of maximum crisis. The second is the post-Cold War Western framing, which often treats it purely as an instrument of Stalinist terror, evidence of a system that coerced its soldiers into fighting through fear. Both of these framings miss what strikes me as the order's most significant historical quality: its honesty. Not moral honesty. The order was not morally honest. It was a document that sanctioned killing Soviet soldiers to prevent them from failing to die fighting Germans. But it was factually honest in a way that Soviet official communication almost never was. It acknowledged that the army was in crisis. It acknowledged that units were retreating without authorization. It acknowledged that the population was frightened, and that the leadership was frightened with them. That acknowledgement, in a classified document, shared only within the military, was a significant departure from the managed reality the Soviet state normally presented to itself. Did it work? This is genuinely difficult to establish. The period from August 1942 onward shows a measurable improvement in Red Army unit cohesion. Fewer documented instances of unauthorized withdrawal, stronger performance in defensive fighting, the extraordinary resilience demonstrated in Stalingrad from September through November. But this improvement coincided with other changes that are equally plausible explanations. The arrival of better-equipped reinforcements, trained on the lessons of 1941. Improved food supplies through both domestic production recovery and early Lend-Lease deliveries. And, most importantly, the natural selection that had been occurring throughout 1942 at the junior and mid-level command tiers. The officers who were still alive and commanding in August of 1942 were, with some exceptions, the ones who had learned how to survive. Isolating Order 227's specific contribution from those other variables is probably impossible. The Soviet state credited it with saving the army. The archive is less certain. Both positions reflect genuine evidence. In the summer of 1942, the Red Army defending Stalingrad was an institution, being held together by a combination of blocking detachments behind it, a city it had been told it could not surrender in front of it, and a desperate tactical creativity in between. It was also an institution in the early stages of learning something about urban fighting, about what happened when combined arms doctrine broke down in rubble, about what individual soldiers were capable of when the formal structure of command dissolved, and they were left to solve problems with what was immediately in front of them. The next chapter of this story takes place inside a city, in the basements of destroyed factory buildings, in tunnels dug between craters, in the space between two armies that were close enough to hear each other breathing. It is the most famous battle of the Eastern Front. It is also, in specific and important ways, badly misunderstood. The Commissar's Notebook. There is a category of Soviet military document that almost never appears in Western documentaries about the Eastern Front, and its absence is a real historiographical problem, because these documents are among the most granular records of how the Red Army actually functioned from the inside. They are called politdonesienia, political reports, and they were filed weekly by the political commissar, the Zampolit, attached to every Red Army unit above company level. The commissar was required to report on the ideological state of his unit, the morale of the men, any complaints expressed, any signs of political unreliability, and any cases of what the official terminology called anti-Soviet sentiment. These reports traveled up a parallel chain, from company to battalion to regiment to division to army to front to stavka, and they exist in the Russian State Military Archive in substantial numbers. What they contain is, depending on the specific document and the specific commissar, either carefully managed political performance or something considerably more honest. A record of what ordinary Soviet soldiers were actually saying and thinking while a world war was happening around them. The institution of the political commissar in the Red Army had its origins in the Russian Civil War of 1917 to 1922, when the Bolshevik government attached political representatives to military units to ensure the loyalty of former Tsarist officers who had been pressed into service. It was revived in its full dual command form in July of 1941, when the German invasion prompted Stalin to reimpose the system that had been partially relaxed in the late 1930s. Under the 1941 version of the system, the commissar at battalion level and above held co-equal authority with the professional commander. Operational orders required both signatures to be legally valid. This was the system that had contributed so significantly to the command paralysis of June 1941. The inability of professional officers to act without political approval, and the inability of political officers to provide it because they lacked the tactical knowledge to evaluate what they were being asked to approve. The system was reformed on the 9th of October, 1942, by NKO Order No. 307, which abolished dual command authority and redesignated the Commissar as Zampolit, Deputy Commander for Political Affairs, with an explicitly advisory rather than executive role. This is one of the most significant and least discussed reforms of the entire war. 16 months into the conflict, having paid for the original system in hundreds of thousands of casualties, attributable in part to command hesitation, the Soviet military formally acknowledged that a political officer with veto power over a professional commander was militarily dysfunctional. The content of the Politdonesiny that survived in the archive is, in the most interesting cases, a document of institutional mediation. Consider an entry from a 62nd Army political report dated October of 1942, the middle of the Stalingrad battle. The report notes that soldiers of a specific company have expressed doubt about the reliability of resupply, and that a named sergeant stated, in the presence of others, that ammunition had been promised 3 days earlier and had not arrived. The Commissar who wrote this report has done something specific. He has recorded the complaint, translated it into the bureaucratic language of expressed doubt about reliability, forwarded it to the supply chain as an actionable request, and in doing so, protected the sergeant from the implication that his statement constituted a criticism of command competence. This is a small act of institutional management performed under fire, in a document not intended to be read by historians 80 years later. It is also evidence of the Commissar system functioning, in this specific instance, not as a surveillance apparatus, but as a grievance channel, a mechanism by which the concerns of ordinary soldiers could, theoretically, reach the level of administration capable of addressing them. The literary archive of the Stalingrad period contains a specific tension that I find more revealing than almost any operational document. Vasily Grossman, the Soviet writer and journalist, covered the battle for Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, the Red Army's main newspaper, from the city's outskirts and, at various points, from within the city itself. His published dispatches in that newspaper describe exactly what Soviet editorial convention required them to describe: courage, sacrifice, ideological clarity, the certainty of ultimate victory. They are well written, and they are shaped by purposes external to the truth of what he saw. His private notebooks, which were not published in the Soviet Union and were not intended for publication, describe something else. In those notebooks, Grossman recorded what he actually witnessed: the physical condition of soldiers, the specific texture of destruction, and at least one incident in which a man was shot for retreating and his family was not notified of the real circumstances, his service record recording instead a battlefield death. The published dispatches and the private notebooks are two entirely different documents. They were written by the same man, at the same time, about the same events, in the same city. The gap between them is the most precise definition available of how the Soviet wartime information system worked. The Commissar's own position within this system was, in practice, considerably more complicated than either its defenders or its critics acknowledged. A Commissar who filed an accurate political report, one that honestly described low morale, supply failures, inadequate equipment, and the specific human costs of command decisions, was potentially useful to Stavka, which needed accurate information to make decisions. He was also potentially dangerous to himself, because accurate reports that reflected badly on the operation could be interpreted as defeatism, disloyalty, or even sabotage. The documented cases of commissars who filed honest reports and subsequently faced investigation are a small but meaningful subset of the archival evidence. Equally documented and equally meaningful are the cases of commissars who filed honest reports and were vindicated because the supply failures they described were real and subsequently corrected. The system occasionally worked as designed. Its baseline dysfunction did not preclude functional exceptions. Both things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is not resolvable from the archive. The parallel reality that the Commissar system sustained, the Polet Donizenia recording actual complaints, Klasnaya Zvezda publishing curated heroism, has a specific intellectual heritage that most histories of the Red Army don't address. The Soviet political commissar system was not a Soviet invention. It was consciously modelled on the French revolutionary system of représentants en mission, political representatives attached to French Republican armies from 1793 to reduce the risk of counter-revolutionary activity among officers who had served under the monarchy. Stalin's government was aware of this precedent. The Soviet military political literature of the 1930s references it explicitly. The Commissar was a technology borrowed from the first modern democratic state, operating under existential military pressure, adapted and applied by a totalitarian state, operating under the same pressure roughly 150 years later. The irony of a revolutionary communist state, borrowing an institutional form from a bourgeois French republic, is precise and, I suspect, deliberate. The practical problem of controlling a military institution is older than any specific ideology, and the solutions tend to resemble each other across very different political systems. By the time the Commissar reform of October 1942 redesignated the Zampolit as an advisory rather than executive role, the Red Army had already internalized a specific lesson from 16 months of catastrophic experience: that political loyalty and military competence were not the same thing, that the attempt to substitute one for the other through institutional design had cost the army an incalculable number of lives, and that the professional military officer, whatever his political reliability, needed the authority to make professional military decisions without waiting for a countersignature from someone who didn't understand the tactical situation. This was not an ideological concession, it was an operational one. The Commissar didn't disappear from the Red Army in October 1942. He simply lost his veto, and in losing his veto, the professional officer gained something he hadn't possessed since 1941: the authority to command. The Rats of Stalingrad. There is an entry in the 62nd Army's Operational War Diary, a carbon copy, typed on a field typewriter with a sticking letter, preserved in the Russian State Military Archive, dated the 14th of October, 1942. It reads, in translation, "Enemy has breached northern perimeter of tractor factory. Close combat. Distance between opposing forces at points is less than 30 meters. Air support and artillery support are impossible. Groups of 6 to 8 men operating independently." That sentence, groups of 6 to 8 men operating independently, is the moment the Battle of Stalingrad became something that had no name in any existing military doctrine. It is the moment an army of millions collapsed, by operational necessity, into a collection of small teams, fighting over individual rooms, stairwells, and basements, because the scale of destruction around them had made any larger formation both impossible to command and impossible to sustain. We need to establish what Stalingrad actually was, before we can explain what it meant, because the mythology of the battle has grown so thick over 80 years that it tends to obscure the operational reality underneath. By mid-October of 1942, the German 6th Army had pushed the Soviet 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, into a strip of destroyed city along the western bank of the Volga River. This strip was, at its narrowest points, less than 1 kilometer deep. The Volga itself was approximately 800 meters wide at this location, and it was the only supply line available to the defenders. Boats crossing at night, under continuous German artillery fire, carrying ammunition and replacement troops, returning with wounded. The 62nd Army was not holding a defensive line in any conventional sense. It was occupying a narrow ledge of rubble at the edge of a river, receiving supplies by boat, and fighting for individual buildings against an enemy that had been advancing across continental distances for 16 months and believed, with considerable documentary evidence to support the belief, that it was about to finish the job. What changed inside that rubble over the 90 days between September and November of 1942 was something that no headquarters ordered and no doctrine anticipated. It was the development, under conditions of extreme pressure, of an entirely new tactical vocabulary. Chuikov's operational diary and the 62nd Army's after-action notes document the evolution of what became known as Sturmovaya Gruppe, assault group tactics. The groups were small, 6 to 8 men, sometimes fewer. They carried submachine guns, primarily the PPSH-41 with its 71-round drum magazine, hand grenades, and improvised close-quarters weapons. Each group was assigned a specific building objective, a specific route of approach, and a specific set of contingencies for what to do when the approach route turned out to be impassable, which it usually was. The key insight, which Chuikov later formalized in training documents, but which appears to have been arrived at empirically by the men doing the fighting before anyone wrote it down, was what Soviet after-action reports called obnimatsya s vragom, hugging the enemy. Advancing so close to the German forward positions that German artillery and Stuka dive bombers could not engage Soviet positions without hitting their own men. The physics of why this worked are specific and worth explaining carefully, because the tactic was not intuitive. The Junkers 87, Stuka dive bomber, the aircraft the Wehrmacht relied on for close air support throughout 1941 and much of 1942, had a minimum safe bomb release altitude of approximately 450 meters, with a release to impact time of roughly 5 to 6 seconds. At that altitude and release point, the circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of released bombs would fall, was approximately 35 to 40 meters. This meant that a Stuka targeting Soviet positions within 30 to 40 meters of German forward lines faced a better than even probability of killing the German troops it was supporting. The Red Army's tactic of maintaining 20 to 30 meter contact distances was, at its core, a solution to a specific aircraft engagement geometry. Chuikov arrived at this conclusion through observation of what worked and what didn't in the first weeks of city fighting. The aerodynamic calculation existed in Soviet Air Force technical manuals. It was not referenced in any infantry combat document. He got there by watching his men die in patterns until the pattern told him something useful. The 14th of October, 1942, the day the tractor factory perimeter was breached, is described in the German 6th Army's war diary as the day of the decisive assault. 5 German divisions with more than 300 tanks attacked simultaneously. The result, from the German perspective, was a significant penetration of Soviet defensive positions, the capture of much of the factory complex, and the reduction of the 62nd Army's bridgehead to its narrowest point yet. From the Soviet perspective, the day's result was that the 62nd Army had not been destroyed. These are not contradictory observations. They are 2 accurate descriptions of the same events from 2 different analytical frameworks. The Germans measured success by territory taken. Chuikov measured survival by whether his army still existed the following morning. On the 14th of October, both things were true simultaneously. Germany made its most significant advance, and the Soviet army survived it. The logistics of sustaining the 62nd Army across the Volga deserve more attention than they typically receive, because they represent a feat of organizational persistence that matched anything happening in the actual fighting. The Volga flotilla's operational logs from the autumn of 1942 document the crossing operations in the flat language of maritime administration. Tonnages, crossing times, vessel designations, cargo manifests, In October of that year, approximately 65% of supply loads were delivered successfully. The 35% that didn't make it was lost to German artillery and air attack on the crossing. In practical terms, this meant that units defending specific buildings were sometimes operating on 48-hour supply delays, men calculating exactly how many rounds remained in a given position and moderating their rate of fire accordingly, not because Doctrine told them to, but because the mathematics of the crossing left them no choice. The army that fought in Stalingrad was an army that had learned to account for every round, because it had learned the hard way that the next delivery was not guaranteed. There is a building on what was Penzinskaya Street in Stalingrad, now Volgograd, that became one of the most celebrated symbols of Soviet resistance in the entire war. The garrison that held it for 58 days is commemorated in every Soviet and Russian account of Stalingrad, the building itself renamed in the post-war period for the sergeant who commanded the initial defense. The Soviet propaganda version of this building's significance, formalized in post-war memorial culture, presents it as a bastion of heroic defiance, a fortified island of Soviet will in a sea of German occupation. Churikov's own memoir, published in 1959, describes it somewhat differently. He writes about the building primarily as a forward observation post with exceptional sightlines to 3 street approaches, useful for directing artillery fire from the Volga's eastern bank onto German positions. Its military value, in Churikov's own account, was as a fire coordination point. The propaganda narrative and the operational record describe, in a specific sense, different buildings. Both versions are sincere. The building was simultaneously what the men defending it experienced and what the army's command structure used it for. And those two things did not have to be identical. What the battle in the rubble was actually producing, beneath the propaganda, beneath the tactical innovation, beneath the daily arithmetic of survival, was the human material for a different kind of army. The men of the 62nd Army who lived through September and October and November of 1942 were being changed by what they experienced in ways that no training program could replicate and no doctrine could fully capture. They were learning things about German tactical patterns, about the timing of relief rotations, about the specific vulnerabilities of German armoured vehicles in enclosed spaces, about the way German infantry behaved differently at night than during the day, that existed nowhere in any Soviet military manual, because no Soviet military manual had been written for conditions like these. The institutional knowledge accumulating in the basements of Stalingrad was invisible to Stavka and invisible to military doctrine. It was living only in the men who had acquired it. And those men, if they survived, were going to be very hard to defeat. Stavka's operational plan for what would become Operation Uranus, the counter-encirclement that would trap the German 6th Army, had been in development since at least September of 1942, while the city fighting was still at its most intense. The 62nd Army, defending the rubble, was not briefed on the plan. Churikov learned that Uranus had been launched on the 19th of November, 1942, at approximately the same time as the German commanders around him did. By the sound of the artillery, to the north and south, that meant something large had begun. The defenders of Stalingrad had been the fixed point around which an enormous operational trap was being set. They hadn't known they were bait. They had simply held. The Intelligence War. In late April of 1943, a summary document was circulating through the upper levels of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, that described, with considerable precision, the shape of Germany's planned summer offensive. The document identified the Kursk salient, a bulge in the eastern front roughly 200 kilometers wide and 150 kilometers deep, as the probable axis of the German attack. It estimated the attacking force at between 17 and 19 panzer and motorized divisions. It gave a probable timing of late May or early June. When the German offensive finally came, on the 5th of July 1943, It involved approximately 17 panzer and motorized divisions, attacking precisely the Kursk salient, arriving 6 weeks later than the intelligence estimate had projected. The estimate was accurate to within 1 division and 2 weeks on timing. Someone, somewhere, knew. The question of how Soviet intelligence achieved this level of precision about a German operation that was itself surrounded by elaborate German security measures is one of the most genuinely unresolved puzzles in Second World War historiography. And I want to be honest about that unresolved quality, rather than paper over it with a confident narrative. The short answer is that Soviet intelligence in the spring of 1943 drew on multiple independent sources: partisan reconnaissance networks operating behind German lines, prisoner of war interrogations, aerial photography, and at least one signals intelligence network operating through Switzerland, known by its codename Lucy. The Lucy network, run by a German émigré named Rudolf Rossler, passed extraordinarily precise German operational intelligence to Soviet handlers through Swiss intermediaries. The source of Rossler's information has never been definitively established. Credible hypotheses include a German army officer with direct access to OKH signals traffic, a British ultra backchannel deliberately routed through Swiss intelligence to avoid directly compromising the ultra-secret, and various combinations of the above. The British official intelligence history, authored by F. H. Hinsley and published in revised form in 1993, explicitly denies any direct transfer of ultra-intelligence to Soviet channels through the Lucy network. Soviet and Russian archival material, partially declassified between 1992 and the early 2000s, suggests the Soviets received order of battle information of a precision that matched ultra-level sourcing. Both national archives have positions that cannot simultaneously be fully true. Neither has fully disclosed its relevant records. This is where the archive leaves us. What matters operationally is not which specific source produced the intelligence, but what the Soviet command did with it. And here the record is considerably clearer. In a series of Stavka planning conferences in April and May of 1943, reconstructed through the memoirs of General Sergei Shtimenko, who served as a senior operations officer at Stavka and had direct access to these discussions, Georgy Zhukov made an argument that ran directly against the Soviet military's institutional instinct. His argument was that the Red Army should not launch a preemptive offensive against the German positions. It should wait. It should allow Germany to attack the Kursk salient, absorb the blow in prepared defensive positions, exhaust the attacking force, and then launch a counter-offensive against an enemy that had already spent its armoured strength. This was, in military terms, a proposal to deliberately accept the tactical initiative and bet everything on the depth and quality of the defensive preparation. Zhukov's argument was made against significant internal opposition. Several Stavka members initially preferred a preemptive strike. That Zhukov won the argument, and that he turned out to be correct, is one of the clearest demonstrations of qualitative change in Red Army strategic thinking between 1941 and 1943. The physical preparation of the Kursk defensive position between April and July of 1943 was an engineering achievement that deserves at least as much attention as any of the tank battles that followed. In the 8 weeks before the German offensive launched, Soviet engineers and troops constructed 8 defensive belts extending 300 kilometers in depth. The figures in the Soviet operational planning documents are worth stating in full. Approximately 3,000 kilometers of trenches, 500,000 anti-tank mines, 440,000 anti-personnel mines, and prepared firing positions for more than 20,000 artillery pieces and mortars. This was not improvised defensive fighting. This was an engineered kill zone, planned in exact detail by men who knew, from the intelligence picture, precisely where the German armor was going to come, and who had spent 8 weeks arranging the ground to ensure that when it came, it would arrive at a place designed to destroy it. The mine density on key approach routes reached 1 anti-tank mine per 2 square meters in certain sectors. The German Tiger tank, at 66 tons, was extraordinarily vulnerable to mine damage to its running gear. The engineering answer to the Tiger was not a better anti-tank gun. It was a mine at the right density in the right place, which the intelligence had identified 8 weeks in advance. There is a specific moment in the Zhukov-Stalin relationship during this period that appears in Shtimenko's memoir and that I find genuinely illuminating about how the Red Army command structure had changed since 1941. Having agreed to the defensive strategy at Kursk in late April, Stalin reversed his position in early June, ordering a preemptive Soviet offensive. Zhukov and Vasilevsky, the chief of the general staff, spent approximately 48 hours persuading him to revert to the defensive plan. This persuasion required sustained professional argument against a man who had executed generals for contradicting him. That it succeeded, that 2 military professionals talked the Soviet dictator out of a strategic decision he had already made, through the force of military analysis rather than political compliance, is a data point about institutional change that no simple narrative of Stalinist command terror can fully accommodate. Stalin in 1943 was not the same commander as Stalin in 1941. He had, at enormous cost, learned to listen to the people who knew more than he did about military operations. The German offensive opened on the 5th of July, 1943, at approximately 0230 hours. The German artillery began its preparatory bombardment. 10 minutes later, Soviet counter-battery fire opened against the German artillery positions. Before a single German soldier had advanced, Soviet guns were already firing on German gun lines. The German 4th Panzer Army's war diary entry for the 5th of July notes, "Unexpected Soviet counter-battery fire at 0240 hours. Effect on our preparation, significant." That 10-minute margin was the intelligence advantage expressed in physical form. The Soviets knew the exact timing of the German offensive start because their sources, whatever combination of Lucy, partisan intelligence, and signals intercepts produced the picture, had provided it. The army that had been caught completely flat-footed on the 22nd of June, 1941, had, in 2 years, built an intelligence architecture capable of knowing when the enemy's guns were going to speak before they spoke. The Tiger tank's mechanical fragility at Kursk is a detail that tends to get lost in the mythology of the battle as a contest between armoured giants, and it matters enough to examine carefully. The Tiger I's Maybach engine, a 23-litre V12 producing 700 horsepower, had a documented reliability problem specific to summer conditions on the Eastern Front. At operational temperature in July and August heat, the engine required coolant flow rates that the Tiger's cooling system, designed to German specifications calibrated for Central European temperatures, could not reliably sustain under sustained high-load conditions. German maintenance records from the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion document that approximately 40% of Tiger mechanical breakdowns at Kursk were attributable to cooling system failure rather than combat damage. The Soviet defensive strategy of absorbing the German attack and grinding it through layered defensive belts, forcing Tiger crews to maintain sustained high RPM operation over extended periods, exploited this mechanical fragility directly. Even if Soviet planners did not know the specific engineering cause, they knew from the intelligence picture that the Tiger was coming. They knew from the terrain assessment that it would have to cross mined ground and fight through multiple defensive belts. They designed the defense accordingly. The engine failures were a bonus they hadn't planned for. The intelligence war around Kursk was not, however, simply a story of Soviet competence against German blindness. German counterintelligence operations in the spring of 1943 were also feeding disinformation into Soviet networks, attempting to manipulate the Soviet assessment of German offensive intentions. The GRU analyst receiving reports from multiple sources simultaneously was not looking at a clear picture. He was looking at genuine intelligence mixed with planted fabrication, and the task of distinguishing between them required a level of analytical sophistication that the Soviet intelligence system had not possessed 2 years earlier. That this analyst, or these analysts, largely succeeded, producing an assessment accurate enough to support the Kursk defensive plan, is evidence of institutional learning in the intelligence apparatus that paralleled the institutional learning happening at the operational and tactical levels. The Red Army that prepared the Kursk defense wasn't just better at fighting, it was better at knowing. Prokhorovka. I need to tell you something about the 12th of July, 1943, that most documentaries about the Battle of Kursk will not tell you. Or rather, they will tell you a version of it. A version involving the largest tank battle in history, roughly equal losses on both sides, and a decisive Soviet armoured victory that turned the tide of the Eastern Front. That version is, in its essential factual claims, substantially incorrect. Not in the sense that the battle didn't happen, or that the Soviets didn't win the wider Kursk campaign. They did, and it was decisive. But the specific engagement at Prokhorovka on the 12th of July was not a Soviet armoured victory. The post-Soviet archival record, examined by Russian military historian Valery Zamulin, who had direct access to the Prokhorovka archive and published his findings in 2013, tells a different story. And it is a story that the official mythology of the battle was specifically constructed to prevent anyone from reading. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov, attacked the German 2nd SS Panzer Corps on the 12th of July in what the post-battle Soviet reporting described as a major armoured engagement, resulting in roughly equal losses. The figures used in the official Soviet history, Volume 3 of the multi-volume History of the Second World War, published between 1973 and 1982, cite German tank losses at approximately 400. Zamulin's archival research, drawing on the Prokhorovka collection and German 2nd SS Panzer Corps records, establishes Soviet tank losses on that day at approximately 400 to 500 vehicles, against German losses of approximately 70 to 80. The ratio is not parity. It is approximately 6-1 in Germany's favour. These figures, specifically the Soviet loss figures, had been classified until 1993. The official history, written while they were still classified, used different numbers. The tension between the official history and the archival record is not a matter of interpretive disagreement. It is a matter of which documents you were permitted to read. Understanding why Rotmistrov's army suffered those losses requires understanding the specific tactical situation the 5th Guards Tank Army faced on the morning of the 12th of July. The attack was ordered under extreme time pressure. Intelligence had suggested a German breakthrough threat elsewhere in the southern Kursk sector that required immediate action. The artillery preparation before the armoured advance was inadequate. The preparation time allocated was insufficient to suppress the German anti-tank gun positions covering the approaches to Prokhorovka. And the T-34's main armament, the 76mm gun of the 1942 model, could penetrate the frontal armour of the German Tiger I at ranges below approximately 500 metres, and was substantially less effective beyond that range. The German Tiger's 88mm gun was lethal to T-34s at ranges approaching 2,000 metres. Rotmistrov's tactical response to this geometry was to order his crews to advance at maximum speed, closing the range as rapidly as possible to reach the sub-500 metre engagement envelope, where the T-34's gun was effective. In doing so, his crews drove at high speed directly through the 2,000 metre engagement envelope of the 88mm guns, which had been pre-registered on the approach routes. Multiple instances of T-34s physically ramming stationary Tiger tanks are documented in German maintenance records from that day, not as desperate last acts, but as the logical conclusion of a tactic that had already accepted the loss of the approach as the price of getting close enough to fight. Rotmistrov was summoned to Moscow to explain his tank army's losses in the days following Prokhorovka. His initial report to Stavka claimed German losses substantially exceeding what German records subsequently confirm. He was not punished, partly because his army's attack had contributed to slowing the German advance sufficiently for the broader defensive system to function, and partly because the political consequences of publicly acknowledging a 6-to-1 loss ratio at what was already being framed as a triumphant Soviet armoured victory were too significant to contemplate. His career was subsequently managed with care. He received decorations. The loss figures were classified. The mythology was constructed around what could be celebrated rather than what had actually happened. Me sitting here with Zemelin's research in one hand and the official Soviet history in the other, I'm not sure what I find more remarkable: the specific scale of the discrepancy, or the fact that the town of Prokhorovka itself contains both the mythology and its refutation within walking distance of each other. The Prokhorovka Memorial, built in 1995, features bronze sculptures 28 meters high and an eternal flame and interpretive panels using the Soviet-era figures. The Prokhorovka Archival Collection, a separate facility, contains the loss reports that contradict the memorial's captions. The museum declined to revise its exhibits in response to Zamulin's findings, which were published by a Russian academic press. The myth and the archive coexist in the same town and do not acknowledge each other. Why did Prokhorovka become the central symbol of Soviet armoured triumph if it was tactically a Soviet defeat? The answer is partly about the broader strategic context. The Kursk campaign as a whole was a Soviet success, and Prokhorovka was part of that success in the sense that it contributed to the attrition of German offensive capacity, and partly about the specific needs of military mythology. The actual architects of the Kursk victory were the engineers who laid 500,000 mines, the staff officers who planned 8 defensive belts 300 kilometers deep, the Signal Corps soldiers who maintained communications across an enormous front, and the intelligence analysts who identified the attack axis 2 months in advance. None of these people have monuments. Their work doesn't produce a dramatic climactic moment that can be photographed and exhibited. Military mythology requires a specific kind of event: a place, a time, a confrontation. Prokhorovka provided that, regardless of the arithmetic that surrounded it. The broader Kursk campaign's outcome is not in dispute. Germany launched Operation Citadel on the 5th of July with approximately 900,000 men, approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and approximately 2,000 aircraft. It halted permanently on the 23rd of July, having penetrated the Soviet defensive system to a maximum depth of approximately 35 kilometers in the southern sector and considerably less in the north. It did not achieve the envelopment of the Kursk salient that was its operational objective. The Red Army then launched its own counter-offensives, Operations Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, which by August had recovered the ground lost and advanced beyond it. What stopped Citadel was not primarily Prokhorovka. It was the depth of the defensive system, the density of the minefields, the volume of Soviet artillery, and, on the 17th of July, the Allied landings in Sicily, which required Hitler to transfer SS armoured units from the Eastern Front. The decisive blow against German offensive capacity at Kursk was struck not in a field outside Prokhorovka, but on a beach in southern Italy. On the 8th of July, 1943, 4 days before Prokhorovka, the Red Army lost 343 tanks and self-propelled guns in the southern sector of the Kursk salient to German anti-tank fire and mines. In a single day. That figure, from the Cambridge Companion to the Nazi-Soviet War, exceeds most historians' estimates for total German tank losses across the entire battle. The Soviet victory at Kursk was purchased at a loss ratio that no Western army of the period would have accepted or survived as an operational entity. The Red Army absorbed those losses and continued functioning because it had more to absorb them with. More tanks, more men, more industrial production, and by 1943, a command structure capable of maintaining coherent operations despite casualty rates that would have paralyzed earlier Soviet formations. The uncomfortable truth at the center of the Kursk story is that the Red Army won a strategic victory by accepting tactical losses that would have been catastrophic for any other army on the field. This is not a comfortable thing to celebrate. It is, however, accurate. The women who weren't there. There is a diary entry written sometime in the summer of 1944 by a Soviet woman serving as a sniper with a rifle division on the Eastern Front. I'm going to read it to you now, and I want you to notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't mention ideology. It doesn't mention the motherland. It doesn't mention hatred of the enemy or love of the Communist Party, or any of the language that Soviet official culture expected soldiers to use when they described their experience. What it says is this: shot today at 400 meters. Clean. The boys are surprised when I tell them I prefer this distance. The rifle is familiar at 400. At 600, the wind matters too much, and I don't like uncertainty. That's it. A professional observation about ballistics and personal preference, written by a 20-year-old woman who was very good at her job and knew it. The entry belongs to Rosa Shanina, whose diary is preserved in the Russian State Archive, and who was credited with 59 confirmed kills before she was mortally wounded near Königsberg on the 28th of January 1945. She was 20 years old. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 800,000 to 1 million women served in the Red Army. The range in that estimate reflects genuinely incomplete demobilization records. Another fact that says something about how the historical accounting was handled. Women served as snipers, anti-aircraft gunners, pilots, combat nurses, signals operators, and, officially denied until 1990, as tank crew and infantry. The Central Women's Sniper Training School, established in 1942, graduated 1,061 trained snipers before the war ended. Of all the women who completed training and went to the front in sniper roles, approximately 1 in 5 survived the war. The school kept training regardless. Its graduates, in combined kill claims, accounted for at least 11,000 confirmed enemy casualties. 91 women received the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest Soviet military decoration. The most operationally extraordinary of the women's military formations was the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, commanded by Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, and known to German soldiers on the Eastern Front by a name they gave it, the Night Witches. The regiment flew Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, a training aircraft with a maximum speed of approximately 120 kilometers per hour, a maximum bomb load of 300 kilograms, and no defensive armament of any kind. These were not combat aircraft in any meaningful modern sense. They were fabric-covered biplanes slower than many trucks, repurposed to fly harassment missions against German rear areas under cover of darkness. The reason they were effective is specific and technically interesting. The Po-2 flew slowly enough that German radar systems, calibrated to track aircraft of substantially higher speed, frequently lost the return signal and classified the contact as noise. Before their bomb runs, pilots cut their engines at altitude and glided toward their targets in near silence. The only sound audible from the ground was the soft passage of air through the rigging wires, which German soldiers compared to a broomstick. the name stuck. By the end of the war, the 588th had flown approximately 30,000 combat sorties and produced 23 heroes of the Soviet Union, more than any other aviation regiment in the Red Army. The Mosin Nagant rifle used by Soviet snipers, the model of 1991 30-stroke with the PU optical sight, is worth describing in specific technical terms because the training that went with it was more rigorous than most people assume. The PU sight provided 3.5 times magnification with a 24mm objective lens, calibrated to 1,300 meters. Soviet snipers at the Central School completed a full ballistic calculation course as part of qualification. The 76.2 by 54mm rimmed round that the Mosin fired had measurably different exterior ballistics at -20 degrees Celsius than at +30, and snipers were required to calculate the relevant holdover corrections without a table, in the field, for both temperature and wind. This was more mathematical training than many Soviet artillery junior officers received. The women who passed this course were not auxiliary soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were trained technical specialists who had mastered a complex analytical skill and were applying it under operational conditions. Shanina's diary entries from the final months of the war are technically detailed in a way that the Soviet state later found uncomfortable. She writes about sight adjustments. She writes about specific conditions, light, wind, distance, with the precision of someone who has spent considerable time thinking carefully about her craft. What she rarely writes about is ideology. This is not unusual. Belarusian journalist Svetlana Alexievich spent years in the 1970s and 80s conducting oral history interviews with Soviet women veterans, and the corpus of testimony she assembled, published in Russian in 1985 under the title "U vojny nezhenskoye litso," translated as "The Unwomanly Face of War," contains almost no ideological language when women describe the experience of combat itself. The ideological register appears in their descriptions of why they volunteered, or how they explain their service to civilians after the war. It is almost entirely absent from descriptions of what they saw and did and felt. The women's experience of the war and the official narrative of why they were fighting it occupied, in their testimony, almost entirely separate compartments. The post-war treatment of women veterans is one of the most telling silences in the entire Soviet archival record. The demobilization order of the 23rd of June, 1945, issued one day after the victory parade in Moscow, specified the order in which different categories of service personnel would be released from military obligation. Women were listed first, not in honor, not in recognition of particular sacrifice, but because the institution wanted them gone before it was finished celebrating what they had helped it achieve. The official multi-volume Soviet history of the Great Patriotic War, published over roughly 2 decades from the late 1950s onward, dedicates approximately 2 pages to women's military service out of several thousand total. Alexievich's collection of women's testimony, compiled from hundreds of first-hand accounts, was submitted to a Minsk publishing house in 1983. Soviet censors held it for 2 years. Their specific documented objection was that the book does not sufficiently reflect the heroic, patriotic spirit of Soviet women's contributions. What the censors were actually objecting to, though they couldn't name it in those terms, was that the women in Alexievich's book were described as fully human, frightened, exhausted, sometimes brutal, sometimes tender, never simply heroic, rather than as icons of Soviet womanhood performing a prescribed role with prescribed emotions. Multiple women interviewed by Alexievich described the same post-war experience in different specific terms. They came home in uniform. They were advised by family members to change before entering their buildings so the neighbors wouldn't see. A woman who had served at the front was culturally stigmatized. The specific slur used in multiple accounts translates roughly as campaign wife, implying that military service was a euphemism for something else entirely. Veteran certificates were slow to be issued for women who had served in combat roles, because the administrative categories available often didn't accommodate what they had actually done. The form had boxes for auxiliary and medical, but not for sniper or pilot in the women's section. Pensions were delayed in documented cases by years or decades. The institutional erasure was not organized as a policy in any single document. It emerged from 100 administrative decisions made by people who had already decided, before they sat down to make them, that the war had been a man's story. Shanina's diary entry for the 25th of January 1945, 3 days before she was wounded by artillery shrapnel, discusses the wind conditions for long-range shooting that day. Northwest, she wrote, at approximately 15 kilometers per hour. Difficult. She was killed on the 28th of January, trying to drag a wounded male officer to cover, a task she had not been assigned and was not required to perform. She was 20 years old. Her diary is in the archive. The entry about the wind is the last complete one. The generals. In the spring of 1943, General Konstantin Rokossovsky attended a Stavka planning conference at which he disagreed with a proposed operational order. Stalin asked him 3 times if he was certain of his objection. 3 times, Rokossovsky said yes. Stalin's response, recorded in General Shtimenko's memoir, which is among the most reliable direct accounts of Stavka's working methods available in any language, was, "You have nerve. I like that. Go and think it over again and we'll talk tomorrow." The following day, Stalin accepted Rokossovsky's proposal. This exchange took place between a man who had been arrested on Stalin's orders in 1937, tortured by NKVD interrogators, and released in 1940, and the man who had signed the order for his arrest. Their professional relationship, navigated across that specific history, produced some of the most effective military planning of the entire war. The 3 men who shaped the Red Army's military recovery more than any others, Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vasilevsky, are regularly described in histories of the Eastern Front as military geniuses, a framing I find simultaneously accurate and insufficient. They were exceptionally capable, but they were also specific institutional products, men who had been formed by the Purge, the Finnish war disaster, and the catastrophes of 1941, in ways that gave them a quality of professional resilience that peacetime military careers very rarely produce. To understand how the Red Army transformed between 1941 and 1944, you have to understand not just what these men decided, but how the institutional context around them changed enough to make those decisions possible. Zhukov's command method is documented in enough detail, through his own memoirs, through the memoirs of subordinates, and through the surviving operational directives, to support a fairly precise characterization. He was operationally brilliant and personally relentless. His planning consistently demonstrated an ability to coordinate forces across enormous frontages and maintain operational tempo that outpaced German response times. He was also documented in multiple subordinate accounts as accepting casualty levels that other commanders would not, ordering attacks he knew would fail in order to fix German forces in place while a more promising operation developed elsewhere. The men who died in those fixing attacks had no way of knowing they were the instrument of a plan that didn't include their survival. This is not a moral judgment about Zhukov. It is an operational description. The Red Army under Zhukov won battles that the Red Army of 1941 couldn't have conceived. It also bled in quantities that no calculation of military efficiency could fully justify. Rokossovsky's approach is documented most clearly in his handling of the northern sector at Kursk, and the contrast with Zhukov's method in the south is instructive. Rokossovsky's pre-battle planning requests emphasized artillery preparation over infantry mass, a specific and deliberate choice to use shells rather than men wherever the logistics supported it. He submitted to Stavka an artillery allocation request for the Kursk defensive sector that several members of the planning apparatus considered excessive. His argument, reconstructed from Shtimenko's account, was direct. If the artillery does the work, the infantry doesn't have to. He was given the allocation. The northern sector of Kursk held more easily and at lower cost than the southern sector, where Zhukov coordinated the response and where the fighting and the losses were more severe. Whether this comparison directly reflects the commander's different philosophies or the different terrain and attacking force strength in the two sectors is something historians genuinely disagree about. The pattern across multiple operations, though, is consistent enough to suggest that the difference in approach was real. Shtimenko's memoir is the primary source I return to most consistently when thinking about how the Red Army actually made decisions at the highest level, and it deserves more attention in Western historiography than it typically receives. Shtimenko served as a senior operations officer at Stavka, effectively a member of the General Staff Secretariat, with direct access to planning discussions, command conferences, and the working relationship between Stalin and his senior commanders. His account describes a working environment that doesn't fit comfortably into either the Stalinist terror narrative or the great generals triumphing over adversity narrative. What it describes is something more mundane and more interesting. A group of professional military men operating under enormous pressure in a system where the political consequences of failure were existential, gradually developing the institutional confidence to give their professional opinions clearly enough to be useful. Stalin's own evolution across this process, from the micromanager of 1941, who specified individual divisional attack axes, to the strategic director of 1944, who set operational objectives and left execution to his front commanders, is documented in Stavka working notes and in Shtimenko's direct observations. It is not the story of a tyrant learning wisdom. It is the story of a political leader learning, at catastrophic cost, that military expertise was a real thing, and that ignoring it had consequences. The post-Soviet revision of Zhukov's reputation is a case study in how primary sources interact with institutional mythology. Zhukov's memoirs, published in 1969, present his role in every major Soviet victory as central and decisive. The Stavka planning documents available to researchers who access the Russian archives after 1991 present a more distributed picture. Multiple major operations, Bagration among them, were primarily planned by Vasilevsky or by the front commanders themselves, with Zhukov acting as a coordinating authority rather than the primary operational architect. Russian military historian Mikhail Meltyukov addressed this gap directly in a 2002 academic paper examining what he called the construction of Zhukov's strategic mythology. The paper is not a demolition of Zhukov's reputation. He was genuinely exceptional, and the gap between a memoir and a planning record doesn't mean the memoir is fabricated. It means that Zhukov was a very capable man who, in writing about himself, made himself somewhat more indispensable than the documentary record strictly requires. The fact that Rokossovsky was Polish by birth, not ethnically Russian, carrying a Polish surname, his NKVD file noting his connection to Polish intelligence as the basis for his 1937 arrest, and that this man commanded the operation that would be named the greatest Soviet military achievement of the entire war, is worth pausing on. Bagration, when it came, was planned and executed by a man whose loyalty the Soviet state had formally doubted 6 years earlier, who had spent time in NKVD custody, and who had returned to command not through political rehabilitation in any ideological sense, but through demonstrated professional competence that the system eventually could not afford to waste. The Red Army's recovery was not a story of ethnic Russian military virtue. It was a story of institutional professionalism surviving and eventually overcoming the political forces that had tried to destroy it. By the start of 1944, the average Soviet Corps commander had between 18 and 24 months of combat command experience at that level. The comparable figure for German Corps commanders, many of whom had been cycling through the Eastern Front's attrition since 1941, was actually slightly higher. But what the Red Army had accumulated by 1944 was something that time in post alone doesn't capture. It had a command layer that had learned, through the specific experience of catastrophic failure followed by recovery, that the institution could survive things it shouldn't have survived, and that this survival was not accidental, but the product of specific decisions made under specific pressures. That knowledge, experiential rather than doctrinal, carried in individual commanders rather than in any field manual, was the Red Army's most durable advantage in the campaigns that lay ahead. Bagration. On the 20th of June 1944, 2 days before the largest Soviet offensive of the entire war was scheduled to begin, the German Army Group Center's intelligence assessment of the situation on its front contained the following conclusion. No large-scale Soviet offensive in this sector was anticipated in the immediate future. This document was produced by the Fremde Heere Ost, the Foreign Army's East Intelligence Department, staffed by professional intelligence officers using aerial reconnaissance, signals intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and agent reports. Their conclusion was not negligent. It was wrong, with devastating precision, about one of the most consequential military events of the 20th century. 1,670,000 Soviet soldiers were 2 days away from attacking across a 700-kilometer front. The intelligence assessment said it wasn't coming. The reason the German intelligence apparatus missed what was in front of it is one of the most instructive stories in the history of military deception, and it requires understanding the Soviet Maskirovka, deception, operation that preceded Bagration in as much detail as the battle itself. Soviet deception planning for Bagration was deliberate, multi-layered, and operated over a period of months. The objective was to convince German intelligence that the main Soviet summer offensive would come in Ukraine, against Army Group North Ukraine, rather than in Belarusia against Army Group Center. To achieve this, the Soviets simultaneously maintained genuine operational security over the actual attack axis, while constructing an elaborate false picture of Ukrainian offensive preparation. Dummy tank concentrations, including inflatable rubber vehicles visible to German aerial reconnaissance, were positioned in Ukrainian sectors. Phantom radio units broadcast increased signals traffic on Ukrainian frequencies using fabricated unit call signs. Real supply movements to the genuine attack axis in Belarusia were conducted at night under air cover. Deliberate disinformation was fed through suspected German agents embedded in Soviet rear areas. The result was that German intelligence assessed Soviet offensive intent as concentrated primarily in Ukraine. The 700-kilometer Belarusian front was assessed as a secondary, quiet sector. It was neither. The German defensive position in Belarusia had been weakened by a specific command decision that Hitler made in the spring of 1944. He designated Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk as feste Plätze, fortified places, to be held regardless of encirclement. German field commanders in these cities were explicitly forbidden to withdraw their forces, even if surrounded. The military logic behind this order was, in a narrow defensive sense, recognizable. Fortified cities could tie down attacking forces and disrupt the operational momentum of an advance. The practical consequence, combined with the German intelligence failure about where the Soviet offensive was coming, was that substantial German forces were fixed in static positions they couldn't leave, arrayed against an attack they hadn't anticipated, on a front they had stripped of armoured reserves in favour of the anticipated Ukrainian offensive. When Bagration launched on the 22nd of June, exactly 3 years to the day after Operation Barbarossa began, the timing was not coincidental. Someone in Stavka had a sense of occasion. The offensive opened on 4 simultaneous axes across the 700-kilometre front, beginning with preparatory artillery fires on the 23rd and 24th of June, at densities approaching 204 guns and mortars per kilometre on breakthrough sectors. This figure, from Soviet operational planning documents, represents artillery concentration at a scale the Red Army couldn't have achieved or sustained logistically in 1941. The pre-battle supply operation consumed approximately 32,000 wagon loads of material for the First Belarusian Front alone, all moved by rail and truck at night, under strict blackout, over a period of weeks. By the 5th of July, all 3 of the major fortified places in the northern and central sectors, Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev, had been either captured or encircled. Minsk fell on the 3rd of July, with approximately 250,000 German troops encircled east of the city. In 11 days, Army Group Center had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent military organization. 25 German divisions, not weakened or depleted divisions, but formed divisions with their command structures and unit identities, were destroyed. German losses in the Bagration operation eventually reached between 400,000 and 540,000 killed, missing, and wounded. The Red Army lost approximately 770,000 killed, wounded, and sick. The supply arithmetic that made Bagration possible requires a specific acknowledgement of something the Soviet state preferred not to advertise. The First Belarusian Front's Chief of Rear Services, the logistics commander, General Nikolai Antipenko, describes in his memoir, Na Glavnom Napravleni, published in 1971, the specific mechanical problem of advancing faster than your own supply chain. By the 5th of July, forward elements of the First Belarusian Front's tank armies were operating more than 60 kilometers ahead of the main supply depots. The bridging equipment for the Neman River crossing had not yet been brought forward. The advance rate, between 20 and 25 kilometers per day, was outrunning the capacity of the logistics system to replenish it. Antipenko's solution, documented in his memoir, was to strip the supply chain of everything non-essential and concentrate on fuel and ammunition, accepting shortages of food and medical supplies at the forward elements in order to maintain momentum. The bet that the German inability to form a coherent defense made the momentum worth more than the supply shortfall was correct. The men at the leading edge of the advance were hungry. They were also in Minsk. The role of the American-supplied Studebaker US-6 trucks in making Bagration's logistical tempo possible is one of the war's most underappreciated material stories. By the summer of 1944, the earlier trickle of Lend-Lease vehicles had become a substantial flow. The First Belarusian Front had approximately 14,700 trucks in its logistics train, of which approximately 4,200 were Studebakers with 2.5-ton payload capacity and 6-wheel drive. The 6-wheel drive mattered in Belarusia specifically. The region's road network, such as it was, became impassable mud after rain, and a 2-wheel drive truck was effectively useless off the main highways. The Studebaker could operate across country at meaningful speed while carrying a full payload. The forward supply point system, mobile depots positioned 15 to 20 kilometers behind the lead tank armies, leapfrogging forward every 36 to 48 hours, could only function with vehicles that could sustain that kind of movement. The physics of the advance were Soviet operational art. The vehicles that made the physics possible came from factories in Indiana and Ohio. On the 17th of July, 1944, 57,600 German prisoners captured during the Bagration offensive were marched through the center of Moscow. The procession lasted 3 hours. It passed through central squares, along main boulevards, past the Bolshoi Theatre. It was led by captured German generals, on foot. Water trucks washed the streets behind the column as it passed. Stalin personally approved the route. Soviet newsreel footage from that day, preserved in the Russian State Archive of Film and Photo Documents, captures the watching crowds in detail. What strikes me about that footage, every time I watch it, is the silence. The crowds are not cheering. They are not jeering particularly. They are watching, with an expression that the camera captures but cannot fully explain. Something between disbelief and a very old, very tired satisfaction. 3 years of the most destructive conflict in human history, distilled into a column of exhausted men walking through a city that 3 years earlier had feared it was about to fall. That silence is the sound of the Eastern Front's turning point. The atrocity equation. There is a notebook entry written in August of 1944 by a Soviet war correspondent traveling with the Red Army through eastern Poland. The correspondent was Vasily Grossman, who had been covering the Eastern Front for the army newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda since the first weeks of the war, and who had seen things that most human beings never see and cannot adequately describe. The entry reads, in translation, "Everything is preserved. The Germans didn't manage to destroy the evidence. There are 800,000 shoes in a warehouse." That sentence, 800,000 shoes, was the first written record in any language of what Soviet forces found when they entered the Majdanek extermination facility near Lublin on the 24th of July, 1944. Not a military assessment, not a political report, a journalist's notebook, recording a number because numbers were the only language available when all other language had failed. Majdanek was the first Nazi extermination facility to be captured by any Allied force during the Second World War. The German administration had attempted to destroy the evidence before retreating, burning several structures and attempting to disperse or conceal the physical remains of the killing process. They ran out of time. Soviet forces arrived before the destruction was complete, and what they found was largely intact. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the administrative records, and the warehouses. The warehouses contained the personal effects of the murdered: clothing, shoes, luggage, the accumulated possessions of hundreds of thousands of human beings, reduced to a supply problem for the German administration that had processed them. The figure of 820,000 pairs of shoes that Soviet investigators eventually documented was not a rounded estimate. It came from a count. Someone counted them. The warehouse was large enough that this took time. Grossman's published dispatch for Krasnaya Zvezda, filed after his visit to Majdanek, described the facility and its evidence. It was the first account of an extermination camp to appear in any press, anywhere in the world. His private notebook, which was not submitted to the newspaper's editorial process and was not intended for publication, contains a detail absent from the published dispatch. He wrote, "I couldn't write it all. I wrote what was possible to write. The rest is for later or never." That gap between what he saw and what he published is itself a primary source. It tells you something precise about the relationship between the Red Army's advance and the information available to the world about what that advance was uncovering. The army was liberating death factories. The journalism could describe some of it. The full weight of what was there went into private notebooks that wouldn't be published for decades. The Soviet investigative methodology applied at Majdanek established a template that would directly shape the Nuremberg prosecutions the following year. Soviet military investigators catalogued physical evidence through systematic photography, cross-referenced administrative records found in camp offices with the physical evidence of the warehouses and facilities, collected testimony from surviving witnesses, and produced a formal investigative report that presented findings in legally structured form. The camp's SS administration had maintained meticulous procurement records, commercial invoices and delivery receipts for the materials used in the killing process, filed as routine administrative documents, indistinguishable in their bureaucratic form from any institutional purchasing record, except for the specific materials described and the address to which they were delivered. These records were found intact. They were catalogued. They became evidence at Nuremberg. The evidentiary methodology the Soviets developed at Majdanek in the summer of 1944, the insistence on physical documentation over testimony alone, the systematic preservation of administrative records as proof of institutional intent, is the direct procedural ancestor of international war crimes investigation practice as it exists today. What the Red Army found as it advanced westward through 1944 and into 1945 was not only the evidence of German crimes against Soviet civilians and prisoners, it was also the accumulated physical reality of what 4 years of German occupation had done to an entire continent's worth of human beings. The extermination facilities at Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Chelmno were all in the eastern territories liberated by Soviet forces. Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated by the First Ukrainian Front on the 27th of January, 1945. What Soviet soldiers encountered at these places, the scale, the systematic organization, the administrative precision of the killing, was not something that any human moral framework had previously needed to accommodate. There are multiple documented accounts of Red Army soldiers who had fought through 3 years of the most intense combat on the planet, finding themselves unable to process what they were walking into when they entered these facilities. The war had accustomed them to destruction. It had not accustomed them to this. But the Red Army's advance through Eastern Europe in 1944 and 1945 was not solely a story of liberation. This is where the historical record requires honesty that the documentary tradition has frequently avoided, and I want to address it directly. In the autumn of 1944, and through the spring and summer of 1945, as Soviet forces entered East Prussia, Hungary, and eventually Germany itself, documented patterns of violence against civilian populations emerged that the Soviet state spent decades suppressing, and that Russian official historiography has still not fully acknowledged. The town of Nemmersdorf in East Prussia was briefly captured by Red Army forces in October of 1944, before a German counterattack retook it. German forces documented what they found when they retook the town: killings of civilians, including women and children. This documentation includes photographs and subsequent testimony submitted at Nuremberg by German prosecutors. On the Soviet side, records from the units involved are either absent from the accessible archive or classified. The German documentation is specific. The Soviet silence is absolute. Both are primary sources. What they prove together is that something happened. What they cannot together establish, because the documentary asymmetry is too severe, is the full scope and specific circumstances of what happened. The broader pattern of Soviet soldier violence against German civilians in 1944 and 45 is attested across multiple source types: NKVD, internal discipline reports, German civilian accounts, neutral observer testimony, and the private writings of Soviet intellectuals, including Grossman himself. The NKVD military internal troops reports on indiscipline from this period, partially accessible through post-Soviet archival releases, document arrests of Soviet soldiers for violence against civilians in numbers large enough to indicate systematic pattern rather than isolated incident. The reports record only cases that resulted in formal arrest. the total incidence was certainly larger. The Soviet propaganda apparatus had spent months in 1944 and early 45 producing material that framed Germany and Germans in ways that, whatever the intent, created a psychological context for the violence that followed. Soviet writer Ilya Ehrenberg's articles in Krasnaya Zvezda through 1944 used language about Germany as a civilization that subsequently shocked many of the Soviet readers who had supported them in the heat of the war's darkest years. Stalin himself ordered Ehrenberg's most inflammatory writing suppressed in April of 1945 as Soviet forces entered Germany and the political requirements of post-war governance began to override the political requirements of wartime mobilization. The suppression was real. Its consequences on the behavior of soldiers who had already internalized months of that material could not be reversed by an editorial decision. I want to be precise about what I'm describing and what I'm not. I'm not describing equivalent crimes. The Nazi program of deliberate, industrially organized, administratively documented mass murder of entire populations, Jews, Soviet POWs, Roma, people with disabilities, and others, was a crime of a specific character and scale that has no equivalence in what the Red Army did in 1944 and 45. The 820,000 pairs of shoes at Majdanek are not equivalent to anything. But the Red Army's advance through Eastern Europe produced documented atrocities against civilians that were real, that were widespread enough to reflect institutional as well as individual failure, and that the Soviet state chose to classify rather than acknowledge. Both things can be true simultaneously. The army that liberated the death camps and the army that committed documented violence against German civilians are the same institution, operating in the same months, sometimes composed of the same men. The uncomfortable weight of that simultaneity is part of the historical record. Grossman saw both sides of this. He documented the extermination facilities in his notebooks and his dispatches. He documented what he witnessed Soviet soldiers doing in his private notebooks and did not publish it. He began writing the novel that would become Life and Fate in the late 1940s. The manuscript described both German and Soviet violence with equal moral seriousness, applying the same ethical standard to atrocities, regardless of which uniform the perpetrators wore. KGB officers arrived at his apartment in 1961 and confiscated the manuscript, the carbon copies, and even the typewriter ribbon. Grossman later said to a friend that they had arrested the book. He died in 1964 without seeing it published. It appeared in the West in 1980, smuggled out on microfilm. The Soviet state's response to Grossman's moral equivalence, the specific decision to confiscate rather than simply censor, tells you more about what the state understood itself to have done than any official history published in the same period. The Partisan War. There is a document filed at the Russian State Archive of Socio-Political History, the RGASPI, that is dated the 12th through 15th of May, 1944, and reads, in its operational summary section, with the flat administrative tone of a procurement report. 1 locomotive destroyed, 11 freight wagons damaged, 1 fuel tanker derailed, and a set of Abwehr courier documents captured at a railway junction in Belarusia. The unit responsible was identified as a partisan brigade operating in the Minsk region. The report was filed upward through the central headquarters of the partisan movement, the TSHPD, which coordinated Soviet irregular operations from Moscow using radio networks, supply drops, and liaison officers parachuted into occupied territory. This document is not glamorous. It is not romantic. It is an operational record of a supply chain disruption operation, reported in the language of a logistics audit, and it represents something the Soviet partisan movement did roughly 11,000 times between June of 1943 and June of 1944, on railway lines across occupied Belarus and Ukraine, as a direct operational component of the Red Army's advance. The scale of the Soviet partisan movement by the middle years of the war was genuinely extraordinary, and it is worth establishing the numbers before we discuss what they mean. By the summer of 1943, the TSHPD estimated approximately 200,000 active partisan fighters in Belarus alone, organized into roughly 1,000 separate units of varying size, quality, and military effectiveness. An additional 500,000 people in the occupied territories provided support functions, food, shelter, intelligence, without active combat participation. The Belarusian forests, among the densest in Europe, provided a geography that German rear area security forces were structurally unable to clear and hold simultaneously. German rear area divisions, the Sicherungsdivisionen, security divisions composed largely of older troops and limited fitness personnel, were assigned to anti-partisan operations across frontages so large that effective area control was impossible. They could sweep an area, killing some partisans and driving others temporarily from their positions, and then watch the partisans return within weeks because there were simply not enough German troops to maintain a presence everywhere simultaneously. The organizational architecture of the TSHPD was, in practice, considerably more complicated than the phrase partisan movement implies. The units operating under its nominal coordination were not a unified force with shared characteristics. They included genuine Red Army stragglers from the encirclements of 1941, who had been evading capture for years in the forests, trained NKVD officers parachuted in to provide direction and maintain political control, local peasants whose primary motivation was survival rather than ideological commitment, Ukrainian nationalist formations fighting simultaneously against the Germans and against Soviet authority, and at least one documented case of a unit that had previously collaborated with the German occupation administration and switched sides when the military balance made continued collaboration professionally inadvisable. The TSHPD managed this mixture through a combination of supply control. Units that didn't maintain radio contact with headquarters didn't receive ammunition drops or medical supplies, and selective enforcement by NKVD personnel embedded within the larger formations. The railway war operation of the summer and autumn of 1943 is the most operationally significant single episode of the partisan campaign, and it deserves specific attention because it was not improvised. It was a coordinated strategic operation planned in direct conjunction with the Kursk counteroffensive and the subsequent Soviet advance. The TSHPD issued a coordinating directive in June of 1943, assigning partisan units specific railway segments with demolition objectives, timed to maximize disruption of German supply lines during the critical operational period around Kursk. In the first phase alone, between June and July of 1943, partisan units conducted approximately 5,000 separate railway demolitions. German Army Group Center supply officer reports from this period document that average resupply transit time from the rear increased by between 25 and 30% during the campaign. That figure, a quarter to a third reduction in logistical throughput on a front already operating under severe supply constraints, had direct operational consequences for the German ability to respond to Soviet pressure. The most technically interesting aspect of the railway sabotage campaign was not the scale of the demolitions, but their method. The primary technique used by partisan saboteurs was not explosive, but mechanical. The removal of the steel fishplate connectors between individual rail sections. Rather than blowing up sections of track, which required explosives that were difficult to supply and created visible gaps detectable by railway inspection teams, Fish plate removal caused derailment failures that looked until a train struck them, like intact track. The technique required no specialized materials, a crowbar and a wrench, available in any rural workshop. It could be accomplished by 2 people in approximately 8 minutes in darkness, leaving no visible evidence of tampering. The technical simplicity was the point. The TSHPD could teach this technique to a village blacksmith in 2 hours, and it could be repeated indefinitely without resupply. The partisan campaign's most effective weapon against German logistics was not the dramatic explosion. It was the missing bolt. The intelligence function of the partisan networks is the aspect of the movement's contribution that is most consistently underrepresented in historical accounts. Perhaps because intelligence work produces no dramatic images and leaves relatively sparse documentation. But it was, in the context of operations like Bagration, possibly the most consequential contribution the partisans made. Partisan units operating in Belarusia in the spring and summer of 1944 were providing Stavka with a quality of ground truth intelligence about Army Group Center's defensive dispositions that no aerial reconnaissance could replicate. Specifically, they provided information about the weakness of German defensive preparations east of Minsk. The information that the German defensive strength was concentrated to the west of the city, rather than distributed equally across the front. This intelligence directly shaped the axis of the Bagration encirclement. The operational decision to drive for Minsk and encircle German forces east of it, rather than attack German strength directly, was enabled by human intelligence from sources on the ground who could see what a camera at altitude could not. There is a moral question embedded in the partisan campaign that the available sources cannot currently resolve, and I want to name it honestly rather than paper over it. German Army Group Center's rear area security reports, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, document a specific Wehrmacht policy regarding partisan activity. For each German soldier killed by partisan action, between 50 and 100 civilian hostages in surrounding villages were to be executed. This policy was implemented. TSHPD internal planning documents from the period, partially accessible through post-Soviet archival releases, show partisan operations being occasionally planned in areas of lower civilian density to reduce what the documents call reprisal exposure. The existence of those planning notes confirms that someone in the TSHPD was aware of the reprisal policy and was factoring it into operational decisions. What those notes do not, and cannot, given what remains classified, tell us is the full extent to which the TSHPD made operational choices, knowing that German reprisals would kill Soviet civilians, and how those choices were weighed against operational objectives. The documentary record has a deliberate gap here that the Russian State Archive has not yet filled. The partisan movement also operated in the context of a much messier political reality in Western Ukraine and Eastern Poland than the Soviet narrative ever acknowledged. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, was simultaneously fighting German occupation forces, Soviet partisan units, and Polish underground formations, in pursuit of Ukrainian national independence that neither Germany nor the Soviet Union would grant. The partisan label, applied uniformly to all irregular resistance activity in the Soviet historical tradition, encompasses both the Red Army's coordinated partisan network and the UPA's entirely separate war, a war that the Soviet state never publicly acknowledged and that continued in active form for years after the German defeat. The last documented combat between Soviet security forces and UPA remnants occurred in 1956. The partisan war that began in 1941 had specific local dimensions that outlasted the conflict it was nominally part of by more than a decade. The Vistula-Oder offensive. There is an entry in the logistics report of the First Belarusian Front, written by General Nikolai Antipenko on the 15th of January, 1945, 3 days into the offensive that would advance the Red Army roughly 480 kilometers in 23 days. It reads, in translation, "Advance rate exceeds supply line extension capability. Main supply depots are now 60 kilometers behind the forward elements. Bridging equipment for Oder crossing not yet forward. Request 200 additional trucks from Stavka Reserve. The enemy has no time to establish a line. We must not give him that time by slowing for supplies. That last sentence is a logistics commander explaining a strategic gamble in the flat language of a supply requisition. He is saying, the advance is outrunning the food and ammunition. Keep going anyway. The risk of stopping is larger than the risk of running short. The Vistula-Oder offensive opened on the 12th of January 1945, when the First Ukrainian Front under Konev attacked from bridgeheads on the Vistula River south of Warsaw. The First Belarusian Front under Zhukov joined the offensive on the 14th. Between them, they committed approximately 2,200,000 men, approximately 6,400 tanks and self-propelled guns, and approximately 46,000 guns and mortars. The artillery densities on the breakthrough sectors reached figures that the Red Army of 1941 would not have been able to produce, or to supply, or to coordinate. In certain sectors, 220 to 250 guns and mortars per kilometre of front. The preparatory bombardment on the breakthrough sectors lasted between 107 and 107 minutes, in some accounts slightly more, and was followed immediately by infantry assault without the usual pause that allowed defenders to recover from suppression. The speed of the transition from bombardment to assault was a specific tactical innovation. Leave no gap between the end of the shells and the arrival of the infantry, because that gap was where the surviving defenders recovered their nerve and their weapons. The German Army Group A, commanded by General Josef Harper, had been warned. Multiple sources, including the Fremde Heere Ost intelligence department, which had apparently learned something from its catastrophic failure to anticipate Bagration, provided assessments in early January 1945, indicating that a major Soviet offensive on the Vistula line was imminent. Harper requested permission from Hitler to conduct a limited withdrawal to a more defensible line, to shorten his front, consolidate his reserves, and absorb the expected blow from a position of greater depth. Hitler refused. The documented OKW conference notes from the 9th and 10th of January record Hitler's refusal specifically. Harper's forces remained positioned in the configuration the Soviet breakthrough plan was designed to destroy. Within 48 hours of the offensive's opening, the German defensive front had been penetrated to depths of 25 to 35 kilometers on multiple axes. Within 5 days, the rate of advance had reached 15 to 20 kilometers per day. Warsaw was liberated on the 17th of January. The conversion from breakthrough battle to pursuit, the operational transition that the Red Army of 1941 had been structurally incapable of making because its logistics collapsed too quickly and its communications couldn't sustain the tempo, is the specific achievement of the Vistula-Oder operation that most clearly demonstrates how completely the army had changed. In 1941, the Wehrmacht had consistently achieved initial penetrations of Soviet lines, only to see the subsequent exploitation stall for logistical and command reasons. In January 1945, the Red Army made the same transition in the opposite direction and sustained it for 23 consecutive days across terrain that had been frozen solid by winter temperatures. The forward supply point system, mobile logistics depots positioned 15 to 20 kilometers behind the lead tank armies, leapfrogging forward every 36 to 48 hours, using American-supplied Studebaker trucks, made the tempo physically possible. Each tank army consuming approximately 300 tons of fuel per day, required roughly 120 fully loaded trucks, making daily supply runs across country in winter conditions. The fuel consumption rose by 15 to 20% below -15 degrees Celsius. The arithmetic was perpetually at its margin. It held. On the 31st of January, 1945, forward elements of Zhukov's First Belarusian Front reached the Oder River at Kustrin. The Oder was the last significant natural barrier between the Red Army and Berlin, 70 kilometers to the west. They crossed it and established a bridgehead on the western bank. The German High Command had expected this crossing to require a minimum of 2 weeks of preparation and assault. It took 1 day. The German Ninth Army had no prepared defense on the western Oder bank because it had not believed a crossing was operationally possible at that speed. German commanders who received reports of Soviet forces on the western bank of the Oder on the 31st of January were initially convinced the reports were errors. They were not errors. They were the consequence of 20 days of advance at a rate that the German military's theoretical planning models assessed as logistically impossible. Stavka then ordered the offensive to halt at the Oder. The decision, made in early February rather than allowing Zhukov to continue the 70 kilometers to Berlin, has been debated by historians ever since. The stated military rationale was real. Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front had not yet cleared the German forces in Pomerania to the north, leaving Zhukov's extended left flank exposed to a potential German counterattack from East Pomerania. The threat was not theoretical. Pomeranian German forces did conduct limited counterattacks in February that created genuine operational complications. Whether those complications were serious enough to justify the pause is where the historical disagreement lies. Zhukov's memoirs argue that his front's strength and the Oder bridgehead's depth were sufficient to sustain a continued advance to Berlin without the Pomeranian flank being cleared first, and that the pause cost the Red Army the war's end in February rather than May. Antonov's planning notes, as reconstructed through Stemenko's memoir, suggest the First Belarusian Front's supply situation was genuinely critical by the 1st of February, and that the logistical risk of continuing was not acceptable. Both of these things might be simultaneously partially true, and the documents that would resolve the question definitively are either not fully accessible or not fully decisive in what they contain. The total material expenditure of the Vistula-Oder operation is a number that requires a moment of specific attention. In 23 days of advance, the combined fronts fired approximately 7,200,000 artillery shells, the highest daily consumption rate of any Soviet operation in the entire war. That figure exceeded the production capacity of several Ural factories for the January and February period, requiring emergency allocation from strategic reserve stockpiles that had been accumulating since the autumn of 1944. The industrial infrastructure that had been relocated east in the desperate autumn of 1941, loaded onto flat cars in Kharkov and Kiev and Leningrad, hauled over the Urals in convoys, losing cars along the way to causes listed as unclear, was by January 1945 producing shells at a rate that it was possible to outspend. The circle from the factory evacuation of 1941 to the shell expenditure of January 1945 is one of the most precise demonstrations of what the Soviet war economy was actually built to do. The race and the ruin. On the 20th of April 1945, Zhukov's First Belarusian Front began shelling central Berlin. The city that had directed the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, a city of 4.5 million people, the administrative and symbolic center of the Third Reich, was now under Soviet artillery fire. The operational fact was straightforward. The political and psychological weight of it was something that no military document had a category for. Soldiers who had survived the encirclements of 1941, the winters of 1941 and 42, the rubble of Stalingrad, the minefields at Kursk, were now approaching the place where all of it had started. What they felt about that approach is documented in the private letters and diaries that survived them. And it was not simple, and it was not clean, and it did not fit the language that official Soviet culture provided for the occasion. But before the army reached Berlin, it had to cross the Zilo Heights. The Zilo Heights were a series of bluffs rising 30 to 40 meters above the Oder floodplain, west of the Kustrin bridgehead, the last significant prepared German defensive line before the city. Zhukov planned the assault for the 16th of April, 1945, and he planned it with a specific tactical innovation: 143 searchlights, positioned along the front, to be activated at the moment of the assault. The searchlights were intended to blind the German defenders on the heights, while illuminating the ground for Soviet infantry and armor advancing toward them. The first Belarusian front operational diary entry for the 16th of April, 0500 hours, records the activation of the searchlights and the commencement of the advance. A subsequent entry, timed approximately 20 minutes later, records that the searchlight illumination was having a negative effect on the advancing Soviet forces. The searchlights were reflecting off a layer of ground fog produced by the saturated spring soil of the Oder floodplain, soil that drains slowly after the winter thaw. The reflected light created a luminous background behind the advancing Soviet infantry, making them visible silhouettes. German gunners on the heights fired at the backlit shapes. By the end of the 16th of April, the First Belarusian Front had suffered approximately 33,000 casualties. Silo Heights had not fallen. Zhukov's response to this failure is one of the most revealing command decisions of the entire campaign, and it reveals something specific about the Red Army's institutional character by April of 1945. He committed additional forces, including tank armies originally designated as exploitation forces for the advance beyond the breakthrough, to the frontal assault on the heights. This decision is militarily defensible. The position had to be taken, and weight of force was the most reliable instrument available given the time pressure of the Berlin operation. It was also operationally expensive, consuming the armoured formations that would subsequently need to fight through the city itself. By the 19th of April, the heights had been breached through sustained frontal pressure. The total cost at Silo, approximately 33,000 casualties in 3 days, was, according to official Red Army statistics, higher than the Germans lost in the entire subsequent Berlin city battle. Zhukov had solved a tactical problem, with a solution that the Red Army of 1943 might have found a less costly alternative to. He solved it and moved on. The competition between Zhukov and Konev for the capture of Berlin was not incidental to the operation. It was, in a specific sense, engineered by Stalin. The operational boundary between the First Belarusian and First Ukrainian fronts was drawn in a way that technically assigned Berlin to Zhukov's axis, while leaving the precise boundary line ambiguous enough to permit interpretation. When Zhukov stalled at Silo on the 16th of April, Stalin telephoned Konev and authorized him to swing his tank armies northward toward Berlin, introducing a competitive dynamic that placed both front commanders under pressure to accelerate, regardless of the tactical cost of acceleration. Soviet after-action reports from the final week of April document multiple incidents of 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian forces operating on the same streets simultaneously, competing for the same objectives. Friendly fire incidents between the two fronts' forces in the Berlin street fighting are recorded in operational logs from both commands. Stalin had, quite deliberately, created a race. The cost of that race, in Soviet casualties attributable to the competitive pressure to advance faster than tactical prudence recommended, is not calculable from available sources, but it is not zero. The city fighting itself reversed or reduced nearly every operational advantage the Red Army had spent 3 years accumulating. Artillery superiority, the instrument that had made Bagration and the Vistula-Oder offensive possible, became a liability in urban terrain where the buildings needed as road routes to advance were destroyed by the shells intended to clear them. Armoured superiority was reduced in city streets, where tank vision was blocked by rubble and German infantry could approach from floors above the tank commander's sightline, placing anti-tank weapons at angles that tank armour was not designed to defeat. Communications were degraded by the rubble blocking radio line of sight at the ranges tactical radios required. The Red Army fought Berlin the way Chuikov had fought Stalingrad, with assault groups, with sappers, with close-quarters weapons, and the accumulated tactical knowledge of 3 years of the hardest fighting in modern history. The difference was scale. Berlin was a city of 4.5 million people, and the operation consumed approximately 2 million Soviet soldiers to clear it. The fighting that liberated the last room took until the 2nd of May. Hitler died in his command bunker on the afternoon of the 30th of April, 1945. Soviet forces reached the Reichstag building, the former seat of the German parliament, that same evening. The 150th Rifle Division fought for the building over approximately 3 days, at a cost to the division of roughly 2,000 casualties. Soviet soldiers raised a flag on the Reichstag roof at approximately 22:40 on the 30th of April. The photograph that became the defining image of the Soviet victory, a soldier raising the flag above the ruined city, was taken by photographer Yevgeny Kaldey on the 2nd of May, in a staged reenactment arranged after the building was fully secured. The original photographic prints show a wristwatch on the arm of the soldier in the secondary position of the image. In the version published and distributed by the Soviet press agency TASS, the second wristwatch visible on the same soldier's other arm, an object whose presence in the image implied looting, had been retouched out. The manipulation of the single most iconic image of the Soviet victory in the war was not concealed. It was simply not discussed. The myth absorbed it without difficulty. It always does. Germany signed its unconditional surrender on the 8th of May, 1945, at Allied headquarters in Reims, and again at Soviet insistence, because the first signing had not included adequate Soviet representation, on the 9th of May in Berlin. The 9th of May became Victory Day in the Soviet Union. In the rubble of the city where it was signed, Soviet soldiers were still fighting pockets of German resistance. The war in Europe ended not with a single clean moment, but with a gradual cessation of shooting across an enormous geography, unit by unit, position by position, over a period of days. Somewhere in that geography, men who had survived from June of 1941 to May of 1945 were still alive. Men who had been conscripted from collective farms and factory floors and university lecture halls, who had been handed weapons and sent west, who had survived things that military doctrine said were unsurvivable, and who were now standing in the ruins of the city they had been pointed toward for 4 years. What they felt is documented in their letters and diaries, and it was complicated, and it was not triumphant in any simple sense, and many of them found, in the days and weeks that followed, that the language they needed for what they had experienced did not exist in any vocabulary the world had yet produced. Aftermath. The victory parade in Moscow took place on the 24th of June, 1945. It lasted 2 hours. 200 captured German regimental battle standards were carried to the foot of Lenin's mausoleum and thrown down. It rained. Soviet newsreel footage from the archive captures Marshal Zhukov reviewing the parade from horseback. Captures, specifically, the moment his horse reared as he approached the reviewing stand, requiring the beginning of his approach to be repeated. The controlled perfection of the victory narrative was itself an act of production that required multiple attempts to get right. This detail is not significant in any strategic sense. It is significant in a human sense. The most carefully staged representation of an enormous military achievement still could not fully control its own execution, because horses are not cooperative, and history is not neat, and nothing about what the previous 4 years had been was adequately captured by 2 hours in a square. The demobilization order issued on the 23rd of June, 1945, 1 day before the parade, specified the sequence in which different categories of service personnel would be released from military obligation. It listed women first, not in recognition of sacrifice, not in honor of contribution. Women, the order specified, were to be demobilized before the oldest male rear area conscripts. The institution that had depended on approximately 800,000 women for its survival had used them as snipers, pilots, anti-aircraft gunners, combat nurses, signals operators, and in roles it officially denied, chose, on the morning after its greatest victory, to send them home first. This was not a logistical decision driven by operational requirements. It was an institutional statement about who the Red Army believed it had been, and about who it intended to remember itself as having been. The gap between those two things is, in a specific sense, the gap between the archive and the mythology. The process of converting 11.5 million soldiers back into civilians took 3 years and required, as an organizational matter, the creation of 33 new military districts simply to administer the flow. Demobilization was conducted in waves, with the oldest soldiers and those with specific technical skills needed in civilian reconstruction released first. The process was broadly successful as a logistical operation. What it was not equipped to handle, what no institutional process in the Soviet Union was equipped to handle, because no institutional vocabulary existed for it, was the psychological reality of what those 11.5 million people were carrying back with them. Soviet medicine did not have a clinical category for what Western medicine would later call post-traumatic stress. The closest available Soviet diagnostic term, reaktivny psychose, reactive psychosis, was applied far less frequently than epidemiological evidence suggests it occurred in the veteran population. Men who had survived 4 years of the most intense combat in modern history returned to a society that had no language for what they had been through, no institutional infrastructure for addressing it, and a cultural expectation that the correct response to survival was gratitude, followed by productive labor in socialist reconstruction. Many of them managed this. Many did not. The documentation of how many did not is sparse, because the Soviet medical system had no reliable mechanism for recording what it had no category for. The honest accounting of what the war cost the Soviet Union requires a specific kind of steadiness to read. Military dead, approximately 8,700,000 confirmed, with total irrecoverable military losses, including prisoners who died in German captivity, and personnel listed as missing, presumed dead, at approximately 11.5 million. Total Soviet war deaths, military and civilian, approximately 26 to 27 million, a figure that the Soviet state itself did not acknowledge publicly until the late 1980s. The official figure during most of the Soviet period was 20 million. As a proportion of the Soviet Union's 1941 population, these losses represent approximately 14% of the country's people. The demographic consequences of losing 14% of a population, concentrated overwhelmingly among young men of working and fighting age, shaped Soviet social structure for 3 generations. The gender imbalance in the Soviet population created by the war's male mortality was still statistically detectable in census data from the 1970s. The economic cost, which tends to disappear behind the human cost in most historical accounts, was calculated by economic historian Mark Harrison at Warwick University as approximately equivalent to 1 1/3 times the entire pre-war Soviet gross domestic product, spent over 4 years. The country spent more than a full year's total economic output on the war each year for 4 years. The capital destroyed, the cities, the infrastructure, the agricultural land, the industrial facilities in the western regions that had not been successfully evacuated, was not recovered to pre-war levels in many categories until the mid-1950s. The rebuilt economy that emerged was fundamentally shaped by the war's requirements. Heavily weighted toward heavy industry and defense production, structurally underdeveloped in consumer goods, and carrying the organizational habits of an emergency mobilization economy long after the emergency had ended. The Soviet Union of the 1950s and 60s was, in its economic architecture, still partly the Soviet Union of the wartime emergency. Georgy Zhukov, the man whose operational decisions had contributed more than any other individual to the Red Army's military victories, was demoted and transferred to a minor district command within approximately 18 months of the victory parade. The specific mechanism was the discovery, during an NKVD search of his personal effects, of artworks and valuables taken from Berlin. The NKVD called this the trophy affair. The behavior was documented and real, and it was also common. The selective application of rules against a specific individual in a system where the rules were widely violated is a recognizable political instrument. Stalin found a victorious marshal with a large popular following and a reputation that exceeded the leader's own politically intolerable. The pattern is almost exactly the pattern by which Tukhachevsky was destroyed in 1937. A genuinely capable professional military figure, eliminated through the application of real but selectively enforced charges, at the moment when his continued prominence became politically inconvenient to the man above him. Zhukov survived. He was not shot, he was demoted, because the political calculation in 1946 was different from the calculation in 1937. But the institutional logic was the same. The state that had required him to save it could not comfortably accommodate what saving it had made him. The doctrine the Red Army developed between 1941 and 1945 did not retire with the war. It was preserved, codified, updated, and transmitted. The concept of deep battle, simultaneous operations across the full depth of the enemy's defensive system, using combined arms at operational scale to achieve breakthrough and exploitation, became the foundation of Soviet and subsequently Russian military doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. The Maskirovka principles, developed and refined for Bagration, became the template for Soviet deception planning in NATO contingency scenarios. The use of massed artillery at densities calibrated to suppress rather than simply neutralize, firing enough shells per meter of front to make defense physically impossible rather than merely difficult, remained the Red Army's signature operational approach through every exercise and every contingency plan of the following 4 decades. The army that had been destroyed in the summer of 1941 and rebuilt through the most brutal possible process of institutional learning produced, in the end, a doctrine so thoroughly validated by operational results that no subsequent Russian military establishment could bring itself to question its foundations. What I keep returning to, having spent considerable time with this archive, is a specific tension that runs through the entire story. The Red Army between 1941 and 1945 was simultaneously one of the most impressive examples of institutional recovery under pressure in modern history, and an institution that imposed on its own members, and on the civilian populations it moved through, costs and damages that no institutional success adequately accounts for. The 12-week lieutenants who died in the winter of 1942 were not adequately represented by the victory their deaths contributed to. The 800,000 women who were sent home first are not adequately represented by the monuments that don't mention them. The soldiers who returned from the war, carrying things that Soviet medicine had no name for, are not adequately represented by the productivity statistics of the post-war reconstruction. History's tendency to resolve the tension between what institutions achieve and what they cost their members into a single coherent narrative is a tendency worth resisting. The Red Army, from 1941 to 1945, achieved extraordinary things. It also did and suffered and inflicted things that achievement does not redeem. Both of those statements are true, and the documentary record supports both of them. And the most honest thing that can be said at the end of 4 years of the Eastern Front is that anyone who finds the story simple has not spent enough time with the archive. By the 9th of May 1945, The army that had been announced in a signals log as having lost communications with its border units and being unable to clarify the situation had advanced from the outskirts of Moscow to the center of Berlin. It had destroyed, in the process, the most capable land army that Europe had produced in the 20th century. It had done so at a cost that no other nation-state in the modern era has paid and survived. The industrial capacity for this survival had been moved east on flat cars in the autumn of 1941, in convoys that arrived at their destinations with cars missing and causes listed as unclear. The officers who commanded the final campaigns had been commissioned on 12-week courses, or released from NKVD custody, or promoted over the bodies of men who had not survived the learning. The doctrine that made the final offensives work had been invented in the basements of Stalingrad and formalized in the planning rooms of Stavka by men who had spent 2 years failing before they understood how to succeed. The victory was real. The cost was real. The archive holds both, and it does not resolve the tension between them. And that tension, the space between what the Red Army became and what it cost to become it, is where the true history of 1941 to 1945 actually lives.